What if the most powerful men in American history weren't just leaders, but also secret poets, ghost whisperers, and jelly bean addicts? From bathtub mishaps to psychic advisors, this isn't your high school civics lesson. This is the bizarre, the hilarious, the downright unbelievable side of the U.S. presidency. Because behind every polished portrait is a strange human story, and some are stranger than fiction. Welcome to the most strange facts about U.S. presidents. You've never met the commanders-in-chief like this before. George Washington. George Washington is often remembered as a larger-than-life figure, but behind the statues and portraits was a man full of unusual quirks. One of the most surprising facts is that he liked hoe-cake, a type of cornmeal pancake, for breakfast. This wasn't just a once-in-a-while treat either. Washington had them served with butter and honey, a dish he preferred so much that it became his daily staple. It's an odd choice for someone often portrayed as stoic and elite, but it reflects his grounding in a simpler colonial lifestyle, despite his lofty position. Another odd trait was his intense fear of being seen in a state of undress. Even his closest aides rarely saw him without his jacket on. For a man who led troops into battle and governed a new nation, this level of modesty seems almost contradictory. It wasn't just a matter of etiquette bordered on obsession. Washington believed appearance and presentation were tightly bound to personal dignity, and he guarded that dignity obsessively, down to the last button. At 6'2", Washington was towering by 18th century standards. His height gave him a commanding presence, which he used to great effect both on the battlefield and in political life. Yet, he never seemed to revel in his stature. Rather, he used it to underscore the seriousness of his role. In portraits, he's always upright, stoic, and formal, never casual, never slouched. This deliberate physical image was part of his broader strategy, to embody the nation's ideal leader through calculated presence. Among his many dogs, one stands out for its name, Drunkard. Yes, Washington kept a foxhound by that name, along with others like Tipsy and Vulcan. These names suggest a sly sense of humor beneath the marble exterior. He was an avid dog lover, especially of foxhounds, and spent considerable time breeding and raising them at Mount Vernon. The choice of names tells us that while Washington may have been severe in public, he allowed himself moments of levity in private life. Another example of his flair for symbolism and drama comes from the horse he rode during the British surrender at Yorktown. He named the horse Nelson, and it became one of his favorites. Washington treated his horses with almost as much reverence as he did people, sometimes more so. Nelson wasn't just a mode of transport. He was a part of a carefully curated image, reinforcing Washington's air of nobility and command. These details, seemingly trivial at first glance, stitch together a more complete portrait of the first U.S. president. They show a man deeply invested in every aspect of how he was perceived, from his breakfast table to his battlefield steed. Washington's idiosyncrasies weren't just oddities. They were strategic tools in his lifelong quest to define leadership in the fledgling republic. What's fascinating is that the strangeness doesn't end with Washington. As we move to his successor, we find a man who was equally complex, if not more so, in his private eccentricities and deeply personal contradictions. Let's turn to John Adams. John Adams. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was a man of vast intellect and boundless energy, but also of deeply peculiar habits. Among the most unexpected was his unusual obsession with manure. Yes, manure. Adams believed passionately in soil enrichment and composting, and he frequently wrote detailed letters about the quality and arrangement of animal waste to improve agriculture. He treated dung not as a nuisance but as a symbol of civic virtue, proof that even the dirtiest things could serve a noble cause when properly applied. Adams was also notoriously self-aware, to the point of brutal honesty. He once described himself as obnoxious and disliked, acknowledging his polarizing nature long before it became political currency. In an era when leaders often cloaked themselves in myth, Adams didn't shy away from his faults. This rawness carried into his personal life as well. He frequently talked to himself loudly, and even used these verbal monologues as a thinking tool while writing or walking. Guests often overheard him muttering critiques or arguments aloud, as if he were still in a courtroom debate. Another strange habit involved a tally system Adams kept in his personal diary. One particular entry revealed he counted how many people he thought respected him on any given day. The results often left him discouraged, but he kept the count going nonetheless. It was part of his lifelong anxiety about being forgotten, overshadowed, or underappreciated, a fear that shaped much of his later correspondence with Thomas Jefferson and others. His peculiarities extended to the physical as well. Adams bit his nails to the quick, especially during debates or moments of high tension. It was a nervous tic, but also a sign of the intense inner pressure he placed on himself. Unlike the composed, image-conscious Washington, Adams was messy, visceral, and unapologetically human. He once napped during Senate sessions while debates continued around Heimanley to wake up and resume with equal vigor. That kind of unpredictability made him difficult to manage but also uniquely compelling. In his personal relationships, Adams showed the same blend of passion and oddity. He and his wife Abigail shared one of the most intellectually rich marriages in presidential history, filled with letters that were part love notes, part political manifestos, and part gossip columns. Adams loved to trade juicy, personal, and political gossip with Abigail, often embellishing stories just to amuse her. It's a side of him that defies the common image of a dour New England moraliste. Was also a romantic, a talker, and a man with an enormous appetite for the drama of life. These 5 facts illustrate that Adams was not just a founding father, but a whirlwind of contradictions, idealistic yet insecure, brilliant yet neurotic, grounded in Enlightenment principles yet prone to superstitions and eccentricities. His habits weren't just strange for the sake of being strange, they were windows into a psyche that helped shape the early republic. But if Adams seems intense and peculiar, just wait until we dive into the mind of Thomas Jefferson, man who rewrote the Bible, kept pet bears, and sent a moose to Paris. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States, was a Renaissance man in the truest and strangest sense of the term. A brilliant thinker, architect, inventor, and writer, he was also a man of many odd fascinations. For example, Jefferson had an unusual obsession with mammoths. He genuinely believed that giant mammals still roamed the unexplored American West, and even tried to prove it. He funded expeditions in part to find evidence of these creatures, and collected fossils in hopes of confirming their existence. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was part of Jefferson's vision of America as a land of untapped potential, physically and intellectually. This thirst for discovery also extended to his dining room. Jefferson loved macaroni and cheese so much that he brought back a pasta machine from Europe and served the dish at formal White House dinners, elevating it to the level of presidential cuisine. It may seem trivial now, but at the time, serving something as foreign and creamy as mac and cheese was eccentric, even subversive. He wasn't just introducing a new food, he was importing an entirely new cultural flavor, quite literally, into the American political sphere. Jefferson's eccentricities weren't limited to his food or fossil hobbies. He had an enormous fascination with clocks, so much so that Monticello, his Virginia estate, was filled with them. One clock even had weights that dropped through holes in the floor to mark the passing hours. He was addicted to timekeeping, weather recording, and systematic observation, meticulously logging everything from daily temperatures to the number of letters he wrote, which totaled in the thousands. His need for data collection wasn't just a scholarly habitat, was a compulsion that helped him feel in control of the chaos around him. Even more striking was Jefferson's decision to rewrite the Bible. Dissatisfied with what he saw as the mystical elements of Scripture, He literally took a razor and glue to the New Testament, cutting out all miracles and references to divinity. What remained, now known as the Jefferson Bible, was a compilation of Jesus' ethical teachings. It was a theological remix of sorts, stripping Christianity down to its moral core. It's hard to imagine a modern president releasing such a personal reinterpretation of religion without sparking uproar, but Jefferson did it with quiet confidence and deep conviction. And then, of course, there's the moose. In one of the strangest diplomatic gestures in presidential history, Jefferson had a dead moose shipped across the Atlantic to France. Why? To settle a scientific debate with European naturalists who claimed American animals were inferior in size and vigor, the moose was his rebuttal, a bold, literal, and very decomposing argument. It was the Enlightenment equivalent of a mic drop. Taken together, these facts paint a picture of a president who wasn't just unconventional. He was obsessed with reshaping the world according to his reason, logic, and personal taste. Jefferson's strangeness wasn't random. It was deliberate, even philosophical. He believed America had to be different from Europe not only in politics, but in culture, nature, and even dinner menus. And while Jefferson's mind reached for the stars, the man who followed him was much closer to Earth. James Madison, a president who may have stood only 5'4", but whose peculiarities filled volumes. James Madison. James Madison, the fourth President of the United States, is often remembered as the father of the Constitution, but his private life was a curious blend of brilliant intellect and fragile nerves. Standing at just over 5'4" and weighing barely 100 pounds, Madison was physically the smallest U.S. president in history. Yet, despite his size, he had a towering influence on American governance. What's stranger is how this influential mind often came wrapped in layers, literally. Madison was so sensitive to cold that he frequently bundled himself in multiple layers, even in mild weather. He was known to appear overdressed in wool stockings and heavy coats, while others wore light linen. Madison's physical frailty was matched by a lifelong fear of illness. A hypochondriac by nature, he routinely believed he was on the verge of death. He monitored his health with meticulous care, sometimes calculating his own pulse for hours, convinced it was skipping beats. Even during his most productive periods like drafting the Bill of Rights, he was often recovering from what he feared were fatal conditions. Ironically, Madison outlived all the other founding fathers, dying at the age of 85. He was also obsessed with weather. Not just an idle interest, Madison kept incredibly detailed logs of temperature, wind, and rainfall. These weren't mere curiosities. He believed weather affected the human mind, particularly clarity and decision-making. He even theorized that wind direction could influence mental sharpness. For Madison, even a gust of air might be a clue to future wisdom or folly. Despite being a prolific writer and thinker, Madison was physically timid and socially reserved. His voice was weak and squeaky, and he often mumbled, which made his public speeches difficult to hear. On more than one occasion, he fainted during political addresses. His fear of confrontation was so acute that he often rubbed his hands nervously during arguments. When cornered socially, he would sometimes lock himself in a room to avoid unwelcome guests, once doing so for an entire day. Even stranger was his habit of writing mundane notes in invisible ink. Madison didn't reserve this tactic for state secrets. She sometimes encoded trivial information just in case. It was a reflection of his obsession with control and secrecy. He even believed that reading novels could overstimulate the imagination, making men emotionally unstable. Instead, he immersed himself in philosophy and political theory, occasionally reading aloud to books in two voices to simulate debate. While he never had children, possibly due to health issues or sterility, he was intensely private about his personal life. He hated being touched and avoided physical affection, even among close friends and family. His sense of order extended into his wardrobe as well, often wearing the same style of black suit every day, to the point where it became almost a caricature. Yet he wore wool stockings year-round, even in the sweltering Virginia heat, and refused to look in mirrors, fearing they might stoke vanity. These 5 facts reveal a man who might seem frail or eccentric on the outside, but who hid a razor-sharp mind beneath all that caution and silence. Madison was proof that power and intellect don't always come in imposing packages they can whisper rather than shout. And as we move from Madison's cloistered intensity to his successor James Monroe, we meet a president who walked long miles alone, named his trees, and predicted the weather by scent, proving that presidential strangeness comes in many forms. James Monroe. James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, is most often associated with the Monroe Doctrine and an era of national unity, but his personal habits and inner life paint a far more eccentric figure. Among the most curious traits was his habit of naming the trees on his property. He treated them almost as friends, walking among them and reportedly speaking to them during moments of stress or contemplation. It wasn't mere whimsy. To Monroe, nature had character and voice, and these silent companions offered solace in a way few people could. Then there was his extreme aversion to banks and paper currency. Monroe carried a deep-seated fear of financial institutions and instead preferred coins and even bartering in certain transactions. For a man who once served as Secretary of the Treasury, this distrust is especially ironic. It wasn't rooted in ignorance. Monroe simply didn't believe banks were honest or reliable. His preference for cold, hard metal extended beyond practicality. He saw it as a symbolic anchor in a rapidly changing and unstable economy. Monroe also believed that bathing in hot water sapped the body of energy. He only took cold baths, no matter the weather or season, a practice he held to even in old age. This was part of a larger belief system that saw self-restraint and simplicity as forms of strength. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who eventually yielded to modern comforts, Monroe clung to older habits with almost ritualistic devotion. He even mended his own coat by hand, rather than pay a tailor, a rare sight in the early 19th century aristocracy. His belief in dreams and omens also veered into the mystical. Monroe often slept in his study, believing it allowed him to channel thoughts more clearly. He recorded his dreams and believed they held practical meaning, sometimes basing daily decisions on their content. He once refused to travel for several days after dreaming of a flooded road, despite clear skies and dry forecasts. It wasn't superstition in the traditional sense. It was a kind of intuitive science, at least in Monroe's mind. Finally, there's the peculiar fact that Monroe died on the 4th of July, 1831, making him the 3rd president in a row to die on Independence Day, following Jefferson and Adams. Even in death, his story was threaded with eerie coincidence. It felt almost scripted, as though fate had written a poetic trilogy to commemorate the birth of the nation. Whether you believe in cosmic patterns or not, the alignment is undeniably strange. James Monroe, so often remembered for policy and diplomacy, emerges here as a man of profound personal oddity. He walked miles in silence, counted stair steps aloud, wore outdated Revolutionary-era clothing decades out of fashion, and whispered to busts of ancient philosophers when alone. Yet behind these behaviors was a man deeply anchored in self-discipline, symbolism, and introspection. And if Monroe's solitude and symbolism seem peculiar, just wait until we step into the world of his successor John Quincy Adams, a man who swam nude in the Potomac, kept a pet alligator in the White House, and graded his own morality like a school report card. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, was perhaps the most intellectually driven and idiosyncratic leader the nation has ever had. He began each morning with a ritual most would find shocking, even by 19th century standards, swimming naked in the Potomac River. Rain, snow, or shine, he would plunge into the cold waters without a stitch of clothing, sometimes accompanied by an aide tasked with guarding his clothes on the riverbank. This daily swim wasn't just for fitness, it was a philosophical exercise in discipline, resilience, and clarity. For Adams, Cold water was purification of the mind as much as the body. And as if his affinity for public nudity weren't enough to distinguish him, Adams also kept one of the most exotic presidential pets in history, a live alligator. The creature, a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette, was housed in a White House bathroom. Instead of relocating the reptile, Adams delighted in showing it off to startled guests, using the bizarre pet as both conversation starter and intimidation tactic. It's the kind of story that sounds made up, except that with Adams, the truth was often stranger than fiction. His intellect was boundless, but so was his need to categorize and record everything. He kept a meticulous diary for over 60 years, writing nearly every day and filling over 15,000 pages. The entries covered everything from political philosophy to self-critiques, including how many letters he wrote, how many miles he walked, and how he graded his own behavior. Yes, John Quincy Adams gave himself moral report cards, assigning letter grades to his conduct, diligence, and even the quality of his thoughts. It was self-discipline taken to academic extremes. Another strange belief? That walking barefoot on wet grass could improve eyesight. Adams was convinced that nature held physical remedies beyond the reach of science. He would often remove his shoes and stroll across dew-covered lawns in the early morning, convinced the Earth's natural magnetism would sharpen his vision. It's one of many examples of his fusion between Enlightenment thinking and personal superstition. He believed in reason, yes, but also in omens, dreams, and signs from the natural world. Perhaps most unusual was the way Adams viewed silence not as emptiness, but as protest. He would sometimes go entire meals or meetings without speaking, a conscious choice to assert presence without performance. He considered silence a weapon of resistance, especially in moral or political debates. It wasn't passivity, it was deliberate tension. When surrounded by chatter, he would often withdraw into contemplative muteness, even humming hymns to himself as a kind of meditative mantra. These 5 glimpses into John Quincy Adams reveal a man who blended brilliance with eccentricity, spirituality with strict logic, and public duty with intensely private rituals. While he wasn't always popular and was often considered cold or aloof, his legacy endures as a reminder that leadership can take many forms, including those most unexpected. And now, from the alligator-loving philosopher-president, we move on to one of the most controversial and hot-blooded figures in presidential history. Andrew Jackson, man who survived duels, fought assassins, and brought a parrot to his funeral that swore so loudly it had to be removed. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, was a storm in human form, fiery, confrontational, and utterly unpredictable. Known for his aggressive politics and iron will, Jackson's strangest facts are fittingly intense. Take, for example, his funeral. It was memorable not just for the large turnout or national mourning, but for the fact that his parrot had to be removed from the ceremony for swearing too loudly. The bird, reportedly taught its vocabulary by Jackson himself, began shrieking curse words in the middle of the service, shocking mourners and clergy alike. It was an unexpected encore from a man who rarely held his tongue in life and apparently trained his pets not to either. Jackson's temper was legendary, but it wasn't all bark. He participated in over 100 duels, yes, actual gunslinging, stand 10 paces duel sand, carried a bullet in his chest for over 40 years as a result of one. These weren't metaphorical fights or spirited debates. Jackson literally risked his life repeatedly to defend his honor, his wife's reputation, or just his pride. He was so committed to the code of personal vengeance that surviving a duel was as routine for him as giving a speech. This same hard-edged personality made him a target literally. He was the first president to survive an assassination attempt. In 1835, a would-be assassin approached him with 2 pistols. Both misfired. Instead of fleeing or freezing, Jackson turned on the attacker and beat him with his cane until he was restrained by others. It's one of the most dramatic scenes in presidential history. An elderly president bludgeoning his own assassin with a hickory cane, embodying the sheer defiance that defined his political life. Not all of Jackson's strange habits were violent, however. He had a deep distrust of banks, a theme that echoed through his presidency and personal life. But it went beyond policy. Jackson literally kept his money in jars buried on his property, believing banks were a den of corruption and manipulation. He once paid off the entire national debt, the only president to ever do so, but personally preferred his savings in coin-filled glass containers hidden in the ground. To him, money was safest when it was under his control, literally beneath his feet. Finally, there's his relationship with animals, particularly horses and dogs. He allowed his dogs to sleep in his bed and named one of his horses Sam Patch, after a famous daredevil. But the most startling animal anecdote? He installed a cannon outside his bedroom window for protection. Whether he seriously thought an artillery piece was a practical form of home defense, or whether it was simply a theatrical display of power is unclear. But it's pure Jackson either way. These facts reveal a man who was unapologetically raw, who blurred the line between personal vendetta and national policy, and who saw every insult as a fight worth having. Jackson didn't just believe in strength, he embodied it in extreme, often bizarre ways. And from this dueling, swearing, parrot-owning whirlwind, we now pivot to a very different kind of strange. Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, traded fire for fashion-tight trousers, perfumed gloves, and an obsession with grooming unlike anything the presidency had seen before. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, was a political tactician of legendary skill, but his personal habits reveal a man just as consumed by image, ritual, and curious superstition. Known as the Little Magician for his short stature and political maneuvering, Van Buren was also one of the most fashion-obsessed presidents in history. He wore extra-tight trousers, meticulously tailored to elongate his 5'6" frame, and spent nearly an hour each morning grooming his signature mutton, chopped sideburns. Appearance wasn't just vanity to him, it was strategy. He believed that a controlled image commanded respect, even if it meant suffocating for style. Van Buren's concern with presentation extended to his accessories. He regularly wore lavender-scented gloves and handkerchiefs, sometimes coordinating them with the seasons. While most presidents were content with basic hygiene, Van Buren treated scent like diplomacian, invisible signal of control and refinement. The irony? He never drank alcohol, despite hosting lavish parties where it flowed freely. His aim was to appear sociable and generous without compromising his own standards, a balancing act that perfectly reflected his political life. He also had a profound obsession with luck and superstition. One particularly strange example: Van Buren believed that sneezing in threes was a cosmic approval. If it happened during a conversation, he would take it as a green light from the universe to proceed with whatever idea was being discussed. It might seem trivial, but he was known to change decisions or halt meetings based on it. His inner circle knew better than to ignore his sneeze-counting ritual. It could shift the entire tone of a conversation. His quirks also extended into his collection habits. Van Buren amassed over 200 walking sticks, many of which had hidden compartments, odd carvings, or animal motifs. Some were never even used. They were stored, cataloged, and occasionally displayed for guests like trophies from a peculiar battlefield. The walking sticks weren't just props, they were expressions of personality, eccentricity, and perhaps a kind of psychological armor. And then there's the goat. During his presidency, Van Buren kept a pet goat that roamed freely on the White House lawn. While not as menacing as Adam's alligator, the goat's presence baffled foreign dignitaries and amused the press. Van Buren never explained his affection for the animal, but it became part of the lore of his oddities, a living symbol of his refusal to conform entirely to presidential expectations. These details sketch a portrait of a man driven by elegance, control, and deeply personal logic. Van Buren was a master of political illusion, shaping both his public persona and private world with the same deliberate hand. His peculiarities weren't signs of disconnection. They were calculated, curated, and inseparable from his understanding of power. And from this image-conscious strategist with a goat on the lawn and lucky sneezes in his pocket, we move on to a president whose time in office was famously short, but whose eccentricities came fast and furious. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural speech in freezing rain, and was dead within a month. But even in that brief window, he left behind a legacy of very strange stories. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States, holds the unfortunate distinction of serving the shortest term in American history's just 31 days. But despite his brief time in office, Harrison managed to cram an extraordinary amount of strangeness into both his life and his legacy. Most famously, he delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, nearly 2 hours long, while standing coatless and hatless in freezing wet weather. He wanted to appear strong and resilient, but the performance likely led to the pneumonia that killed him a month later. It was a fatal commitment to optics, and one of the most ironic cautionary tales in presidential lore. Beyond this tragicomic introduction, Harrison's habits and beliefs were equally bizarre. For instance, he refused to use forks, calling them unmanly prongs. He insisted on eating with a knife, spoon, or more often than not, his hands. Even at formal meals, this behavior persisted, causing unease among guests and staff alike. To Harrison, the fork was a symbol of European decadence. He prided himself on frontier simplicity, even if it meant sacrificing basic table manners. He also had a peculiar bedtime habit. He frequently slept fully clothed, including his boots. Whether indoors or outdoors, Harrison often saw no reason to change out of his garments. He viewed sleeping attire as a weakness, believing that a man should be ready for action at any moment. This frontier mentality never left him, even as he stepped into the most powerful office in the country. Comfort, for Harrison, was not a virtue, it was a threat to discipline. One of the more unsettling facts about Harrison was his belief that mirrors were dangerous. He regularly covered them with cloth at night, convinced that reflections held some malevolent energy. He referred to them as spies of the soul, and disliked being alone with uncovered mirrors after dark. Whether rooted in superstition or simply personal unease, this phobia governed his sleeping spaces, even in the White House. And then there was his obsession with dreams, particularly their supposed prophetic power. Harrison kept a notebook beside his bed in which he recorded his dreams, many of them vivid and symbol-laden. He believed they held keys to decision-making, both personal and political. One recorded entry detailed a dream where he was surrounded by silent, headless soldiers in a fog-covered battlefield days, before delivering his fateful inaugural speech. He interpreted this as a warning, but ignored it in the name of duty. In hindsight, the symbolism seems eerie. Though his presidency ended before it truly began, Harrison's peculiar behavior suggests he would have been one of the more unconventional occupants of the Oval Office. His life was a blend of military bravado, rugged superstition, and deep-set habits that harkened back to simpler, stranger times. Even in death, he left behind a legacy of caution. Never confuse bravado with invincibility. And from a president who died almost as soon as he took office, we transition to one who survived decades of change and fathered a dynasty so vast that his grandchildren were still alive well into the 21st century. John Tyler, nicknamed His Accidency, was every bit as strange as his title implies. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, is perhaps best known for becoming the first vice president to ascend to the presidency after the death of a sitting president, earning him the derisive nickname His Accidency. But beyond that historical footnote lies a man whose personal life and behaviors were as unconventional as his political rise. Tyler holds a record that no other president has even approached. He fathered 15 children. Due to his later-in-life parenting, 2 of his grandsons were still alive more than 150 years after his presidency, extending his living legacy into the 21st century. But Tyler's strangeness was not limited to procreation. He had an odd domestic routine. Each of his children was assigned a different day of the week to speak at dinner. It wasn't a punishment, it was structure. With so many mouths at the table, Tyler believed scheduled speech time would create order and encourage better communication. Whether it did or not, the image of a household where conversation rotated like a duty roster is certainly unique among presidential families. His eccentricity extended into how he communicated with himself. Tyler reportedly practiced mirror arguments, debating with his own reflection to rehearse political points or speeches. These sessions could go on for extended periods, and aides often overheard him raising his voice at no one in particular. He claimed it sharpened his rhetoric. It's not hard to imagine a man pacing before a gilded mirror, railing against imaginary dissenters, perfecting every line for an audience of one. Even his superstition ran deep. He believed that sneezing during a conversation meant the speaker had committed a moral misstep. He would interrupt meetings to comment on it, and sometimes demand a topic change. Tyler also refused to shake hands on Thursdays, calling it a cursed day for contact. Visitors were warned in advance, no matter how important the occasion, if it fell on a Thursday, handshakes were off the table. Tyler's home life was a museum of quirky choices. He named furniture and spoke to his writing desk as if it were a trusted advisor. One of his chairs was dubbed the Thinker's Throne, and guests were not allowed to sit in it without invitation. He also had a strict policy of sleeping only while facing south, claiming that it aligned his body with the Earth's energy. Beds facing north were said to confuse the mind. Whether based on personal belief or pseudoscience, this unusual rule was adhered to even during travel. John Tyler defied expectations in every way, from how he governed, to how he dined, to how he organized his household. His behavior may have been dismissed by some as aristocratic eccentricity, but to Tyler, each quirk was a form of personal order in a chaotic world. He didn't just lead a nation, he curated a universe according to his own peculiar codes. And from the man who assigned speech slots to his children and debated with chairs, we move to James K. Polk, perhaps the most work-obsessed president of all time, who banned dancing at his own inaugural ball and kept track of every cough and sneeze he ever had. James K. Polk. James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, was arguably the most intense workaholic ever to occupy the White House. He treated the presidency not as a role to inhabit, but as an all-consuming mission that demanded sacrifice, structure, and unrelenting discipline. Polk worked such punishing hours and with such single-minded focus that it's believed the presidency may have literally killed him. He died just 103 days after leaving office, physically and mentally spent. Polk's strange devotion to order manifested in his meticulous tracking of his health. He kept a notebook detailing every cough, sneeze, fever, and bodily irregularity he experienced. This was not just the log of a cautious man, it was an obsession. Polk recorded these symptoms with the same precision he applied to government reports. Some days, he noted his physical state by the hour, convinced that total awareness of the body would lead to greater mastery of the mind. That same obsession with control extended to sound and space. Polk banned dancing at his inaugural ball, the only president to do so. He considered it a distraction from the seriousness of governance. To him, dancing was frivolous, noisy, and undignified. In fact, he was known to walk in total silence for hours to collect his thoughts, avoiding social interactions even in the middle of public ceremonies. During his presidency, even leisure was converted into ritualistic contemplation. Another curious trait was his intense distrust of being touché, especially while asleep. He had a deep phobia of physical contact during rest, to the point that even his wife was reportedly forbidden from disturbing him once he'd fallen asleep. This paranoia fed into a larger belief that sleep was a vulnerable, almost sacred state. He even refused to keep clocks in his bedroom, believing that the visible passage of time could interfere with dreams and mental clarity. Polk's distaste for joy didn't stop with dancing or touching. He believed music could distort the dignity of a mind at rest, and often asked for musical instruments to be removed from rooms where he worked. He banned playing cards and dice from the White House, viewing them as signs of moral weakness. Instead, he filled his space with symbols of labor, government documents, ledgers, and legal texts. Even his favorite desk nicknamed the Silent Senator was treated with reverence, as though it had its own legislative soul. One of Polk's most personal rituals involved a miniature Bible he carried in his coat. He touched it before every meeting or major decision. Unlike many of his predecessors who quoted scripture aloud, Polk used the book like a talisman, quietly, privately, but always present. It was as much a compass for his moral code as it was an anchor in moments of pressure. These oddities paint a portrait of a man who didn't simply do the job of presidente, became its servant. Polk burned so brightly in his ambition that he left nothing for afterward. His presidency was a deliberate sprint to the finish line, completed with mechanical precision and emotional restraint. And now, from a president who rejected joy for productivity, we turn to Zachary Taylor, a rough-edged general who slept on cots, chewed tree resin, and viewed mud as medicine. If Polk was structured and austere, Taylor was earthy, erratic, and impossible to pin down. Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States, was a man who brought the battlefield into the White House mud, cots, tobacco, and all. Nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, Taylor's presidency and personality were a direct extension of his military career. He preferred sleeping on a wooden cotivan in door sand, often rejected the comforts typically afforded to someone in his position. To Taylor, soft beds were for the soft-minded. His personal quarters were often so sparse and rugged that visitors likened them more to a military outpost than a presidential residence. Taylor's hygiene and grooming habits were, by modern standards, alarmingly lax. He rarely bathed, claiming that dirt acted as a natural shield against disease. He once famously told a critic, "God put mud here for a reason." That philosophy extended to his boots, which were nearly always caked in soil. Even in state meetings, he would track dust across polished floors without apology. His belief in the protective power of filth may seem absurd now, but Taylor embraced it like a personal creed. One of his strangest health beliefs involved pepper. He thought it was harmful to digestion and banned it from all White House meals. Staff and guests were warned in advance, no pepper, under any circumstances. It wasn't just a preference, it was a conviction, born out of his deep mistrust for overly spiced or fancy food. He preferred plain boiled beef and pickles, often consuming them for breakfast. Culinary refinement, in Taylor's view, was suspiciously unmanly. He also had a notable disdain for fashion and formal attire. Taylor often wore worn, dusty farmer's clothes, even when meeting diplomats or attending official functions. His trousers were patched, his jackets ill-fitting, and he frequently tied his hair back with twine instead of using proper grooming tools. Once, during a military parade thrown in his honor, he was mistaken for a stable hand by a visiting dignitary. Rather than correct the man, Taylor reportedly laughed and walked away. His rough appearance wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, a statement of his refusal to conform to elite norms. Perhaps the most eerie and ironic fact about Taylor was his death. On a hot summer day, he consumed an excessive amount of cherries and iced milk at a public event, then fell violently ill. He died just 5 days later. Though officially diagnosed with acute gastroenteritis, Rumors of poisoning circulated for over a century, prompting a 1,991 exhumation of his body. Tests found no traces of arsenic or foul play, but the strange and sudden nature of his demise still fuels speculation. After all, for a man who rejected doctors, ignored hygiene, and dismissed poison theories as city gossip, the timing couldn't have been more mysterious. Zachary Taylor's oddities were not eccentricities layered over refinement. They were who he was at the core. He governed as he lived, simply, stubbornly, and with an unpolished authenticity that baffled the political elite. His presidency was brief, but his persona was unforgettably an accidental populist who treated the White House like a bivouac camp. And now, from a president who refused forks and formalities, we head into the realm of Millard Fillmore, an infamously fastidious man who once stopped a parade over a stepped-on shadow and believed paisley handkerchiefs could provoke the senses. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore, the 13th President of the United States, often slips through the cracks of public memory, but not because he lacked eccentricity. In fact, Fillmore may be one of the most peculiar personalities ever to occupy the Oval Office. While his policies were largely forgettable, his personal life was anything but. For starters, he had an almost pathological obsession with cleanliness and order. He kept multiple shoe brushes in every room of his home, terrified that dirt on shoes could lead to chaos in the mind. Once, he even stopped the parade because someone stepped on his shadow, a moment of public absurdity that seemed perfectly normal to him. His fastidious nature extended to his grooming rituals and domestic routines. Fillmore refused to wear anything red, calling it an emotionally unstable color. He believed hues carried emotional weight, and his wardrobe was dominated by blacks, grays, and whites. Colors, he said, helped him balance the day. He also refused to shake hands with anyone who had uneven fingernails. To him, asymmetry in a handshake suggested an imbalance of character. Visitors were sometimes examined subtly before being greeted, and staff were expected to meet his peculiar grooming standards as well. One of his strangest habits was his disdain for mirrors. Fillmore believed that mirrors drained energy and often covered them with velvet when not in use. He even claimed sleeping near uncovered mirrors could allow evil thoughts to enter a person's dreams. This belief governed how guests were arranged in the White House and how rooms were furnished. He once ordered a guest room to be stripped of all reflective surfaces because he didn't want visiting diplomats waking up spiritually disoriented. His writing habits were no less unusual. When anxious, Fillmore wrote letters in a spiral pattern starting in the center of the page and circling outward. He said it helped him organize his thoughts in a way linear writing could not. Many of these spiral-written letters survive today, baffling historians with their meticulous yet cryptic appearance. It's a strange window into how his mind worked, rigid, methodical, and constantly seeking symbolic meaning and structure. He was also famous or infamous for his dietary self-experiments. In one instance, he reportedly ate nothing but crackers and boiled carrots for an entire month just to test his willpower. He believed that by limiting his palate, he could strengthen his moral fortitude. His meals were so bland that even 19th century guests, accustomed to minimal seasoning, found them hard to stomach. Fillmore, however, took pride in his austere menus, considering them reflections of his inner restraint. Millard Fillmore's presidency may not have left a major policy legacy, but his personal habits have stood the test of historical curiosity. His life was a study in obsessive control of his surroundings, his senses, even his own emotions. In an age of revolution and expansion, he turned inward, micromanaging everything down to the alignment of candlesticks. And as we move on from a man who covered his mirrors and measured his bookshelves for nocturnal movement, we arrive at Franklin Pierce, a president tormented by tragedy, obsessed with shadows, and prone to giving speeches drunk enough to salute trees. Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, was a deeply tragic and profoundly strange figure whose life was defined by loss, introspection, and eerie habits. From the moment he entered the presidency, Pierce seemed weighed down by sorrow and perhaps madness. Before taking office, he witnessed a horrific train accident that killed his last surviving child, a trauma that cast a permanent shadow over his time in the White House. That darkness bled into nearly every aspect of his personal and political life, manifesting in ways that ranged from morose to downright surreal. Pierce was known to wander cemeteries alone for hours. He said the silence of the graves calmed his nerves and allowed him to think clearly. These walks were not rare stuff, and locals often saw him pacing through rows of headstones in the early morning or late evening, sometimes whispering to himself or appearing to speak to the dead. He claimed the dead had no false intentions, unlike the politicians and lobbyists surrounding him. In a way, the cemetery became his sanctuary, a space where honesty required no dialogue. That same discomfort with the living world showed in how he treated reflections. Pierce had a phobia of mirrors at night and would turn them to face the wall before going to bed. He believed they could trap nightmares or reflect back pieces of the soul during sleep. Guests in the White House were often puzzled to find rooms devoid of mirrors or full-length glass. Pierce had them removed or shrouded in heavy fabric. His fear of chaos extended to food as well. He banned cheese from his personal meals, claiming it caused nightmares and clouded the moral senses. He also refused to eat with odd numbers of guests, convinced that dining with 5 or 7 people disrupted spiritual balance. Even meals had to conform to a metaphysical logic that only he seemed to understand. Pierce also had a penchant for absurd and erratic public behavior. On one occasion, he gave a speech while mildly drunk, tripped over an American flag, and saluted a tree. Yes, a literal tree. Though aides tried to spin the incident as an accident, it became emblematic of his increasingly unstable demeanor. His dependence on alcohol was widely known, and while it may have dulled his pain, it also made him unpredictable in moments of public engagement. Then there was Martha the Witness, the name he gave to his favorite tree at home. He spoke to it often and is said to have once consulted it before a major policy decision. To Pierce, the tree was a symbol of endurance, something that stood firm and silent in a world of betrayal. Whether or not he truly believed it could offer guidance is unclear, but he certainly treated it with more reverence than many of his advisors. Pierce's presidency is frequently ranked among the least effective, but his personal life is undeniably fascinating. His habits, fears, and spiritual beliefs paint a picture of a man who could never quite distinguish the boundaries between the seen and the unseen, the real and the symbolic. He didn't merely carry his grief-built rituals around it. And from a president who saluted trees and feared mirrors, we turn now to James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor to ever hold the office, a man who counted forks at every meal, and who once claimed a breeze in the White House was a ghost disapproving of his policies. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, holds the unfortunate distinction of being one of the most criticized presidents in American history, but his personal habits and quirks form a portrait far stranger than his political legacy suggests. The only lifelong bachelor to occupy the White House, Buchanan's domestic life was a tightly curated world of ritual, superstition, and quiet eccentricity. One of his most peculiar habits was counting the number of forks at every meal. Whether at state dinners or private suppers, Buchanan was known to pause and silently tally the utensils before eating. He claimed it was a way of preventing theft or worse, of avoiding subtle manipulations. This obsessive behavior unnerved his guests, but for Buchanan, order at the table was a form of mental clarity. A missing fork wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign of deeper disorder. His anxieties extended beyond silverware. Buchanan had a fierce dislike of laughter in public settings. He believed laughter should occur only in private, and reportedly glared at aides or guests who chuckled during official business. He once called laughter the sound of undisciplined spirits, and preferred a cold, composed atmosphere in all meetings. This austere view of emotional expression fit his tightly wound public persona, where even joy was regulated by etiquette and control. Then there was his relationship with mirrors, more accurately, his refusal to have them near him while sleeping. Buchanan called them the spies of sleep, believing that mirrors left uncovered at night could interfere with dreams or even siphon off energy. He banned mirrors from his bedroom and insisted that guest rooms also be stripped of reflective surfaces. These beliefs weren't just preferences, they were deeply embedded fears that shaped the layout and ambiance of the presidential residence. Buchanan also displayed an eerie blend of superstition and sentimentality when it came to inanimate objects. He wrote thank you notes to furniture being replaced in the White House, referring to them as faithful servants of the Republic. These weren't quick scribbles. Either they were formal letters expressing gratitude for years of quiet service. Whether this was poetic symbolism or a genuine attachment to furniture is debatable, but it added to his mystique as a man who often seemed more comfortable among objects than people. He also held a curious belief about drafts of air in the East Room of the White House. On one occasion, he claimed a sudden breeze was not caused by the weather, but by the ghost of a disapproving founding father. He even remarked to an aide, "That wind carries the judgment of Washington." This wasn't said in jest. Buchanan often ascribed spiritual or emotional meaning to natural phenomena and saw omens in everything from candle flickers to the rustling of drapes. In his solitude, Buchanan formed deep routines to preserve a sense of balance. He referred to the Constitution as his iron bride, a phrase that echoed both his commitment to law and his own unfulfilled romantic life. His letters are filled with meticulous documentation of dreams, moods, and habits. He preferred solitude so thoroughly that he once turned his chair toward a corner during dinner just to avoid conversation. And despite being labeled indecisive by critics, his private life was governed by a rigid, almost obsessive structure. These 5 strange facts help unveil the private Buchanan, a man consumed by etiquette, haunted by superstition, and yearning for control in a world spinning toward war. He wasn't just politically cautious, he was existentially cautious, wary of forks, laughter, and even furniture. From this stoic bachelor with fork-counting compulsions and ghost-haunted hallways, we turn to Abraham Lincoln, the towering figure who stored papers in his hat, pardoned soldiers for having mother's eyes, and joked at funerals to cope with the weight of a nation breaking in half. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, is often mythologized as a solemn giant who led the country through its darkest hours. And while his leadership during the Civil War was indeed monumental, Lincoln was also a man of striking personal quirks, gallows humor, and deeply odd habits. Far from detracting from his greatness, these eccentricities humanize him, revealing how he coped with unimaginable burdens not by retreating into stoicism, but by weaving the strange into the fabric of his daily life. For starters, Lincoln had an unusual storage method for important documents. His hat, not metaphorically his actual stovepipe hat. He routinely stuffed it with notes, drafts, letters, and even legal briefs, carrying his thoughts with him wherever he went. This impromptu filing system may seem careless, but it was highly characteristic of Lincoln's mind, creative, cluttered, and always thinking several layers deep. Lincoln's body matched his towering intellect, stood at 6'4", making him the tallest U.S. president. Yet, his voice was surprisingly high-pitched and nasal, creating a jarring contrast between appearance and sound. Many first-time listeners were thrown off by it, but once he started speaking, his words quickly commanded attention. He used this oddity to his advantage, often disarming tense rooms with unexpected jokes delivered in his unmistakable twang. Perhaps the most haunting of Lincoln's eccentricities was his recurring dream of his own death. He reportedly told aides and family members about a dream where he wandered the White House, only to come upon a covered body in the East Room. When he asked a soldier standing guard who had died, the soldier replied, "The President." The dream disturbed him deeply and eerily. It occurred just days before his assassination. Lincoln believed dreams carried prophecy, and he often recorded them in a small leather book, treating them as spiritual guideposts. Despite the weight of war and tragedy, Lincoln never lost his black sense of humor. He would frequently tell jokes even at funerals, a form of emotional release. When criticized for being inappropriate, he would simply say, "If I couldn't laugh, I'd die." His laughter was a shield, a coping mechanism forged in hardship. He'd use humorous stories to diffuse tension in cabinet meetings or to soften grim news. One famous anecdote has him joking with Union generals mere hours before receiving devastating battle reports. Then there was his relationship with animals, which bordered on the whimsical. Lincoln loved catchy. Let them eat at the White House dinner table and claimed they were smarter than most of his cabinet. He also had a pet turkey named Jack, who was originally intended for Christmas dinner until Lincoln pardoned him, creating what many consider the first presidential turkey pardon. When his young son asked to spare the bird, Lincoln replied, "Let him live." It was a moment of levity in a presidency filled with darkness. These strange habits and beliefs offer a deeper view into Lincoln's soul, a man riddled with sorrow, endlessly empathetic, and reliant on the odd and the humorous to endure historic pressure. He was not just a leader, he was a man trying to keep his sanity as the world burned around him. His strangeness was not a footnote, it was essential to his survival and success. And now, from a president who dreamed of his own death and pardoned a turkey mid-war, we move on to Andrew Johnson, man who sewed his own clothes as president, refused to use soap with scent, and once shined his boots with whiskey. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, rose from extreme poverty to the nation's highest office and brought with him a set of personal quirks that were as unconventional as his path to power. A tailor by trade, Johnson never abandoned the skills of his first profession. Even as president, he often sewed his own clothes and kept tailoring needles and thimbles in his desk drawer as lucky charms. For Johnson, clothing wasn't just fabrics, it was identity. The act of stitching seemed to ground him in a reality that politics never could. Johnson was a man of intense routines and powerful suspicions. He refused to use scented soap, insisting that clean has no smell. Guests at the White House noted that he was unusually averse to artificial fragrances, whether in soaps, oils, or even flowers. He believed that added scent corrupted natural purity, and his living quarters often smelled faintly of wood, cloth, and ink, never perfume or polish. The White House under Johnson, some aides remarked, smelled more like a tailor's shop than a seat of power. One of his most unusual beliefs centered on buttons. Johnson saw them as symbols of control and discipline. He always buttoned his coats from the bottom up, never the top down, and considered it a metaphor for his rise from poverty. "One builds from the ground," he once said. He believed the order of dressing influenced the order of thought, and he often judged others' character by their grooming habits and clothing symmetry. It was a philosophy stitched right into his jacket. His phobias extended beyond fashion. Johnson had a deep mistrust of mirrors, believing they reflected only vanity and self-deceit. He covered or avoided them wherever he lived, and he preferred rooms without reflective surfaces. He also had a fear of birds, specifically crows, and refused to make major decisions if one flew past his window. Aides noted that several important cabinet meetings were rescheduled after a particularly bad omen day. Johnson also had a strange relationship with speech. Despite being a lifelong orator, he refused to give major addresses on Tuesdays, claiming the day was cursed for communication. When asked why, he gave a typically cryptic reply: "Bad digestion makes worse headlines." It became an inside joke among staffers that nothing meaningful would ever be announced on a Tuesday, no matter how urgent. Among his more tactile oddities was his method of shining boots. He refused conventional polish, preferring whiskey as a cleaning agent. He believed the alcohol gave leather an honest sheen. and he personally shined his own boots before big meetings or appearances. Sometimes, he would do this while muttering political grievances aloud, his voice echoing through the halls as if speaking to ghosts. Andrew Johnson's presidency was marred by political turmoil. He became the first U.S. president to be impeached, but his personal life was just as turbulent beneath the surface. He feared symbols, embraced superstition, and clung tightly to the tradesman's rituals that had once defined him. His quirks weren't just eccentric, they were acts of self-preservation in a world that never seemed to accept him fully. And now, from a president who ironed his own clothes and dodged crows before meetings, we turn to Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War hero who wrote with charcoal pencils, let a raccoon live in the White House, and once got a speeding ticket on horseback. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States and the Union's legendary Civil War general, was a man of contradiction, stoic, yet soft-hearted, brilliant under pressure, yet painfully shy, and strangely simple in his personal habits. Though immortalized in bronze as a grim military leader, Grant in private life was a man of quiet eccentricities and deeply ingrained quirks that added surprising depth to his already complex character. For instance, Grant had a peculiar habit of writing only with charcoal pencils. Even as president, he preferred them over ink pens, which he claimed were too fussy and too formal. He believed charcoal captured thought more honest, raw, and impermanent, like memory itself. On more than one occasion, important White House documents were discovered to be scrawled in smudgy pencil, the markings often fading under handling and time. For Grant, clarity of thought mattered more than the permanence of the page. Despite his wartime image as a rugged, cigar-chomping warrior, Grant had a remarkably tender side, especially when it came to animals. During his presidency, he allowed a pet raccoon to freely roam the White House. The raccoon was named Rebecca and became a fixture at official events, startling guests and reportedly stealing silverware. Grant adored the animal and once told a visiting dignitary, "She's got better manners than most politicians I know." He even had a custom harness made so the raccoon could accompany him during walks on the lawn. Yet Grant's love for animals contrasted sharply with his struggle to connect with people. He was notoriously shy in public and often avoided eye contact. At large social events, he would sometimes disappear mid-conversation, retreating into private quarters without explanation. Staff quickly learned not to take it personally. Grant simply reached a limit with small talk and preferred solitude to social performance. Perhaps the most ironic of his quirks was his well-documented speeding ticket. While president, Grant was stopped in Washington, D.C., for riding his horse too fast through the city streets. The officer who stopped him had done so once before, and this second time issued a formal citation. Grant reportedly accepted it with grace and even commended the officer for doing his duty. It remains the only known instance of a sitting president being arrested for a traffic violation, a strange legacy for a former general known for charging headlong into battle. Grant also had an unusual sense of taste literally. He hated most vegetables and had a deep affection for rice pudding, which he requested so frequently that White House staff jokingly referred to it as General's rations. He could eat it 3 meals a day without complaint. Even during major diplomatic events, Grant preferred to dine plainly, often confusing foreign dignitaries who expected lavish American banquets and instead received modest, milk-heavy desserts. These quirks reveal a side of Grant that history often overlooks, the gentle, methodical, oddly charming man beneath the granite statues and battlefield myths. His eccentricities weren't distractions, they were coping mechanisms, anchors for a man who had lived through the nation's most brutal war and carried its scars beneath a quiet exterior. And now, from a president who fed raccoons and wrote in charcoal, we turn to Rutherford B. Hayes, a man whose wife banned booze from the White House, who believed in spiritualism, and who used Morse code to communicate with his cats. Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, is often remembered for winning one of the most controversial elections in American history. But beyond the political compromise that landed him in the White House, Hayes was a man full of curious habits, mystical leanings, and genteel oddities that made his presidency quietly bizarre. One of the most well-known quirks of Hayes's time in office was the absence of alcohol at official events. This wasn't Hayes's doing. It was his wife, Lucy, who earned the nickname Lemonade Lucy for banning all liquor from White House functions. Hayes complied without resistance, but privately he found ways to sneak a bit of wine or brandy into less formal gatherings, often offering it to guests in unmarked decanters. He joked in letters that the ban was an experiment in forced virtue, and that his real fear was not prohibition, but poor quality lemonade. Hayes also had a deep interest in spiritualism and the occult, which was all the rage during the post-Civil War years. He attended private seances, kept volumes on ghost phenomena, and believed that dreams were often prophetic. He once delayed a cross-country trip after dreaming of a train accidentally to find that, days later, a train on that same route derailed. To him, it was proof that intuition was not superstition, but a science not yet understood. His diaries are filled with accounts of premonitions, unexplainable noises, and signs he believed came from beyond the veil. Perhaps the most whimsical of Hayes' habits involved his cats. He had several during his time in office, and it said he tried to train them to respond to a form of Morse code tapping. Hayes, fascinated with technology, had learned telegraphy during the Civil War and believed animals could adapt to rhythmic communication. He would tap sequences on the floor or furniture and reward the cats if they came, hoping to establish a language of sorts. While the success of this feline telegraph network remains unclear, Hayes took the experiment seriously and even referenced it in letters as progress with mixed results. His tech obsession didn't end with cats. Hayes was the first president to have a telephone installed in the White House, though he rarely used it because there were so few people to call. The White House phone number was 1. Hayes once picked up the receiver out of curiosity and startled the operator, who thought she was being pranked. When asked about it later, Hayes said, "It's a marvelous thing, but a lonely one." Then there's his peculiar walking ritual. Hayes believed that walking in precise, geometric patterns could sharpen the mind. He would stroll in squares or triangles across the White House lawn, turning sharply at specific degrees he calculated in advance. Staff eventually learned not to interrupt these walks. To Hayes, the pattern was more than exercise. It was meditation, logic, and mental alignment, all in one. These strange habits, from ghost watching to cat telegraphy, reveal Hayes as a man caught between two worlds, the old traditions of pre-war America and the emerging marvels of modern science. His oddities weren't signs of detachment. They were expressions of a mind trying to make sense of a rapidly changing nation and an uncertain future. And now, from a spiritualist president tapping messages to his cats, we move on to James A. Garfield, a man who could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously, who kept a ferret as a desk pet, and whose final months became a morbid national science experiment. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, is often overshadowed in history due to the brevity of his presidency only 199 days before his assassination. But within that short time, and the decades leading up to it, Garfield demonstrated a mind so brilliant and habits so peculiar that he stood out as one of the most eccentric intellects ever to hold office. Perhaps the most famous of Garfield's oddities was his rare ambidextrous ability to write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously. He would perform this feat as a party trick, or sometimes during lectures, astonishing friends, students, and scholars alike. For Garfield, it wasn't just a show of skill, it was a reflection of his deeply divided brain, always processing multiple ideas at once. This wasn't a metaphor. He lived in two cognitive realms at the same time, and often said that no idea should ever sit alone. Garfield also had an unusual White House companion, a pet ferret named Nimble. Unlike more conventional presidential pets, Nimble had full run of Garfield's office. The ferret would curl up on his papers or dart across the desk during meetings, startling visitors and delighting the president. Garfield believed animals sharpened focus and brought balance to political life. "Men scheme," he once said, "but animals are honest." Nimble, with his twitching nose and boundless energy, became a kind of unofficial mascot for the few months of Garfield's tenure. A lifelong academic, Garfield was also known for his obsession with measuring things. He carried a small measuring tape and caliper in his pocket, and would frequently measure furniture, books, coins, even people's heads while speaking with them. He claimed that exact dimensions revealed a truth unseen by eyes alone. Once, while waiting for a meeting, he measured the exact height of every book on a shelf and rearranged them in ascending order. To him, order wasn't just aestheticity, was evidence of reason. Garfield also kept an inspiration log, a notebook in which he jotted down stray philosophical thoughts, metaphors, and scientific predictions, often in code. One entry speculated on the potential of wireless communication long before radio waves were fully understood. Another imagined electrochemical wires that could store the thoughts of men, eerily foreshadowing modern computing. He never published these ideas. They were private exercises in creativity and problem-solving, shaped by a mind that was ceaselessly curious. His death, too, became one of the strangest presidential events in American history. After being shot by Charles Guiteau, Garfield did not die immediately. Instead, he lingered for months while doctors probed his body with unsterilized fingers and rudimentary tools, unable to find the bullet. During this time, his room was converted into a medical theater of sorts, with physicians experimenting in real time on what amounted to a living case study. Even inventor Alexander Graham Bell tried to locate the bullet using a metal detector prototype, but failed partly because Garfield was lying on a metal bed frame, which interfered with the device. The entire nation watched in a mixture of horror and hope as the president became a tragic science experiment. These 5 strange facetious linguistic, dual-wielding, ferret companion, obsession with measurements, prophetic thought logs, and morbid medical finale reveal a president whose life was lived on an intellectual tightrope. Garfield didn't merely occupy the presidency. He illuminated how peculiar genius can look when squeezed into political confines. And now, from the philosopher-president who wrote in code and entertained ferrets in his study, we turn to Chester A. Arthur, a man with 80 pairs of pants, a secret nighttime barber, and an identity crisis so profound he burned all his personal papers before he died. Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur, the 21st President of the United States, ascended to office following the assassination of James A. Garfield, a man seen as a political puppet, a product of the corrupt New York machine. But what the public didn't expect was that this sharply dressed, enigmatic figure would also become one of the strangest and most elusive personalities to ever occupy the White House. Let's begin with the wardrobe. Arthur was, without exaggeration, obsessed with fashion. He reportedly owned over 80 pairs of pants and would sometimes change outfits multiple times a day. Nicknamed the gentleman boss, he believed clothing was not just style, but a form of moral discipline. He once told a friend, "If you must be in politics, at least be dressed for the part." His wardrobe was meticulously curated, and his custom-tailored suits were often imported from Europe. He even had a valet assigned solely to manage his gloves. His grooming habits were no less extravagant or odd. Arthur employed a secret nighttime barber who trimmed his famously immaculate mutton chop sideburns while the president was either reading or reclining. The sessions were so quiet and consistent that White House staff joked the barber was a ghost. Arthur insisted that no one, not even his closest advisor Sever, witness these grooming rituals, treating them as private performances of identity upkeep. Despite his obsession with appearance, Arthur was deeply insecure about his origins. He was born in Vermont, but conspiracy theories claimed he had been born in Canada and was thus constitutionally ineligible for the presidency. Though these rumors were unfounded, they haunted Arthur throughout his career. In response, and perhaps to preserve his own myth, Arthur did something unprecedented. He destroyed nearly all of his personal correspondence and private papers before his death. Today, historians still mourn the lost insight those documents could have provided, as Arthur left behind a nearly spotless and opaque record. It was as if he wanted to erase the man behind the perfectly tailored suits. Arthur also had an unusual attachment to the number 4. He believed it was his power number and arranged aspects of his daily life around it. He scheduled important meetings at 4 p.m., made major announcements on the 4th of the month when possible, and even chose to be sworn in for the presidency at precisely 4:04 p.m. When questioned about it, he simply said, "It's when I feel most alive." The number had no known personal significance, only that he found comfort in its symmetry. Then there was the redecorating. Upon assuming the presidency, Arthur found the White House decor to be outdated and offensive to his refined tastes. He had nearly 24 wagon loads of furniture, curtains, and paintings hauled away and auctioned off, including pieces dating back to John Adams. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to remodel the interior, adding vibrant stained glass elements, gilded mirrors, and opulent chandeliers. It was the most flamboyant White House makeover in history. To Arthur, living in aesthetic mediocrity was unacceptable, even if it meant discarding historic artifacts. These 5 strange facts reveal a man caught between reality and image, secrecy and showmanship. Arthur's presidency was quieter than his predecessors, but his private world was full of rituals, vanity, and carefully constructed illusions. He was a man who ran the country like a gentleman's parlor, with style, precision, and a door that always closed quietly behind him. And now, from the man who burned his past and bathed in elegance, we journey into the life of Grover Cleveland, a president so devoted to privacy, he underwent secret surgery on a boat, dodged the press with double identities, and once kidnapped his own adopted child from her legal guardians. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, was the first man to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office, a record he held alone until 2025. But beyond this constitutional trivia, Cleveland was a figure of striking contradictions and intensely strange behaviors. A man of strict public morality and severe private secrecy, he maneuvered through scandal, illness, and controversy with an uncanny talent for disappearing from sight when it mattered most. Perhaps the strangest and most infamous episode of his presidency was his secret cancer surgery in 1893. At the height of a national financial panic, Cleveland noticed a suspicious growth on the roof of his mouth. Fearing that news of his illness would destabilize an already fragile economy, he arranged to have surgery conducted in absolute secrecy in a yacht in the middle of Long Island Sound. Surgeons removed a portion of his upper jaw and part of his palate while the president was strapped into a modified barber chair aboard the vessel. The public was told he was on a fishing trip. Even his vice president didn't know the truth. Cleveland returned to work shortly after, speaking through a rubber prosthetic, with no one the wiser for decades. Cleveland also had an obsessive devotion to privacy that often tipped into paranoia. He once used multiple aliases to book hotel rooms when traveling incognito, and had a habit of changing his walking routes at random intervals to avoid being followed. During his first term, he even instructed the White House staff to keep all interior doors slightly ajar so he could hear approaching footsteps. To Cleveland, privacy wasn't a luxury, it was armor. One of the more bizarre and ethically troubling events of his life involved a young woman named Ruth, the daughter of his late law partner. Though he was not her biological father, Cleveland became her legal guardian and funded her education. When she reached adulthood, he married her, becoming the only president to wed in the White House. The age gap was nearly 3 decades. Before the wedding, Cleveland reportedly took Ruth away from her guardian's home unannounced, convincing her to relocate and live under his care. The move drew whispers at the time, and today, it's considered one of the most morally perplexing chapters in presidential history. Cleveland was also fiercely anti-technology in his private life. He detested the telephone, which he called a dreadful screeching device. Though installed in the White House, he rarely used it. He preferred handwritten letters, often with peculiarities like using a green-tinted ink and writing in dense blocks of text without paragraph breaks. He claimed this kept thoughts unified, though it left his correspondence notoriously difficult to read. And then there was his passion for pigeon racing. Yes, pigeon racing. Cleveland raised homing pigeons and took great interest in their performance, frequently releasing them from different towns and timing their return to his home. He believed pigeons represented a purity of communication and trusted their instincts more than newspapers. When asked why he trusted pigeons over reporters, he replied, "A pigeon carries a message. A reporter carries a motive." These 5 strange facts reveal a man defined by control over information, over perception, and over the chaos that seemed always to circle around him. Cleveland was not warm, nor particularly charming, but he was calculating, elusive, and always several steps ahead of public scrutiny. His life was a quiet battle between exposure and concealment, and almost always, concealment won. And now, from a secretive president who underwent covert surgery at sea and preferred pigeons to press, we step into the era of Benjamin Harrison, man who electrified the White House, was afraid to touch light switches, and whose pet goat once broke free and dragged a screaming cabinet member down Pennsylvania Avenue. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, served between the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland. While his presidency is often viewed as staid and conventional, Harrison himself was anything but. Beneath his stern exterior lay a man of peculiar fears, strange domestic adventures, and one of the most memorable presidential goat chases in American history. To begin with, Harrison was the first president to electrify the White House. But while he embraced the marvel of electricity in theory, he was absolutely terrified of it in practice. So terrified, in fact, that he and his wife refused to touch the light switches. If no staff member was nearby to operate them, they would sleep with the lights on. Harrison feared he might be electrocuted just by flipping a switch, convinced the current might surge into his fingertips. The irony was thick. Here was a man ushering in modern technology while cowering from its basic function. But that's only the beginning of the oddities. Harrison had a deep fascination with the post office, so much so that he reportedly read postal regulation manuals for fun. He believed the postal system was the backbone of democracy and could quote, "shipping rates from memory." As president, he would sometimes show up unannounced at local Washington, D.C., post offices just to observe the operations and occasionally correct minor procedural errors. Some clerks initially thought they were being pranked when the President of the United States began offering unsolicited efficiency tips. At home, Harrison had a peculiar attachment to his pet goat named Old Whiskers. The goat, originally a gift to his grandchildren, soon became a fixture of White House life. One day, however, Old Whiskers broke free of his harness and charged out of the White House gates, dragging along with him Harrison's grandson and accidentally Secretary of State John W. Foster, who had attempted to intervene. The goat galloped down Pennsylvania Avenue in broad daylight, with one screaming child and one panicked cabinet member in tow. The incident was widely reported in the press, and Harrison, with his typical deadpan, remarked only, "Whiskers exercised his right to freedom." Harrison also had an unusual relationship with time. He was obsessive about punctuality, to the point where clocks in the White House were calibrated down to the second. But more strangely, he believed time had a spiritual presence. He kept a thought hourglass on his desk and would flip it whenever he was stuck on a difficult decision. During the sand's descent, he allowed no interruptions, believing that watching the grains fall helped align his thinking with the rhythm of the universe. Perhaps most curious of all was his fear of draft-sand old 19th century obsession taken to new heights. Harrison believed that cool breezes indoors could unravel the mind. He ordered the sealing of several windows in the White House and had heavy velvet drapes installed in nearly every room. Staff were prohibited from opening doors too quickly, and at least one official meeting was postponed because a hallway window had been left cracked. These 5 strange traits make Harrison a far more colorful character than his buttoned-up portraits suggest. He was a man standing on the edge of the modern world, eager to embrace its innovations but hesitant to touch the light switches that made it shine. His oddities weren't just idiosyncrasies, they were expressions of a deeper tension between progress and caution, modernity and superstition. And from this goat-chasing, draft-fearing, switch-avoiding modernizer, we move forward to William McKinley, a president who wore red carnations for luck, communicated through hand signals with his wife during state dinners, and may have owed his life to a missing flower until the day he forgot to wear one. William McKinley. William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, presided over a pivotal moment in American history, leading the nation through the Spanish-American War and into a new era of global influence. But beneath the polished speeches and calm demeanor was a man ruled by ritual, personal superstition, and a quiet devotion to routines that bordered on the mystical. One of McKinley's most curious quirks was his unwavering attachment to red carnations. He considered them his good luck charm and was rarely seen without one pinned to his lapel. Whether delivering a speech, signing legislation, or greeting guests, the red carnation was always present. He gave them freely to visitors, often removing his own to offer as a token of warmth or encouragement. The habit became so closely tied to his image that newspapers began calling it his scarlet seal of fortune. The eerie twist? On the day he was shot by an assassin at the Pan American Exposition in 1901, McKinley had just handed his carnation to a young girl moments before. It was the only major public appearance he ever made without wearing one. McKinley also had a unique method of communicating with his wife, Ida, during formal dinners and receptions. Ida suffered from epilepsy, and McKinley was fiercely protective of her dignity. During social functions, he developed a subtle system of hand signals and eye movements to check in on her status signals, so discreet that few noticed them even after years of public observation. If she began to feel unwell, McKinley would silently excuse them both without drama. He never allowed her condition to become spectacle, and in private, he would reportedly sing lullabies to soothe her during seizures. Despite being surrounded by the trappings of modernity, McKinley was surprisingly averse to new inventions. He distrusted the telephone and often dictated messages to be delivered by hand, even within the White House. He disliked automobiles, claiming they moved faster than a man's thoughts. He preferred to ride in a horse-drawn carriage and once postponed a cabinet meeting because the street outside was blocked by a stalled motor car, which he refused to pass. McKinley also had an obsession with order down to the arrangement of his furniture. He believed every object in a room emitted energy based on its orientation. Desks had to face north. Chairs were to be placed at 45-degree angles when not in use. Even papers on his desk were arranged in exact symmetrical piles. On one occasion, an aide shifted a paperweight slightly, only for McKinley to pause mid-sentence, notice the change, and stop the meeting to correct it. Even thoughts lose their balance in crooked spaces, he muttered. Then there was his oddly intense relationship with food, more specifically hot drinks. McKinley drank scalding coffee, far hotter than most people could tolerate. He insisted on being served it immediately off the stove, no matter how many times he burned his tongue. He claimed the heat cleared the fog from his mind, and once dismissed a White House chef for letting it cool too long before serving. The burn, to him, was worth the clarity. These 5 strange aspects of McKinley's life reveal a man who lived in quiet tension with the world around him, balancing superstition and logic, ritual and modernity, love and public life. His presidency may have ushered America into an imperial age, but McKinley himself remained deeply personal, deeply structured, and strangely superstitious until the very end. And now, from a man who believed a flower could guard fate, we turn to Theodore Roosevelt, a president who boxed in the White House, climbed mountains with one arm in a sling, and once gave an 84-minute speech after being shot in the chest. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, was more force of nature than mere manna hurricane in a tailored suit. Bursting with energy, curiosity, and contradictions, Roosevelt's life was a parade of strange feats, wild routines, and behaviors so eccentric they seemed pulled from an adventure novel. Yet every oddity had a perspicacious quirk, a reflection of a man determined to live with more vitality than the world could contain. Let's begin with one of the most famous episodes of Roosevelt's life, the time he was shot and still gave a speech. In 1912, while campaigning for a 3rd term under the progressive Bull Moose banner, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. The bullet lodged near his ribs, but instead of going to the hospital, he pulled out a blood-soaked 50-page speech, which had absorbed part of the bullet's force, declared, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," and proceeded to speak for 84 minutes. Only afterward did he allow doctors to examine him. The bullet stayed in his chest for the rest of his life, because removing it posed too much risk. Roosevelt also boxed regularly while in the White House, not in secret, but with military officers, athletes, and friends. These weren't light sparring sessions either. He once sustained a serious blow that left him blind in one eye, though he kept it hidden from the public for years. His obsession with combat extended beyond boxing. He practiced judo in the East Room and kept a punching bag nearby. When not fighting, he hiked through Rock Creek Park barefoot or on horseback, often dragging reluctant diplomats on endurance treks just to see who could keep up. Among his many eccentric habits was his practice of sleeping with books literally. Roosevelt read obsessively, often devouring 1 to 3 books per day, even while president. He'd bring stacks to bed, and sometimes fall asleep on top of them. He memorized passages, wrote notes in margins, and insisted on testing aides with impromptu trivia questions. He read in multiple languages and once recited epic poetry to a stunned group of visitors while polishing his revolver. Then there's the White House menagerie. Roosevelt turned 1,600 Pennsylvania Avenue into a veritable zoo. In addition to the standard dogs and horses, he and his children kept guinea pigs, snakes, lizards, owls, badgers, and a one-legged rooster. His son Quentin once brought a pony up the White House elevator to cheer up a sick sibling. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they were sometimes greeted by a parrot shrieking in Latin or a badger trying to climb their trousers. Roosevelt adored this chaos. It was, to him, the pulse of a lively home and a free country. Perhaps his strangest obsession was with mortality itself. Roosevelt carried death masks of historical figures, including Abraham Lincoln, and displayed them proudly. He believed contemplating death made one appreciate life more deeply. He often visited battlefields alone, reciting poems and talking to the wind. On one solo hike through the Adirondacks, he encountered a cougar and simply stared it down until it wandered off. For Roosevelt, death was not a thing to fear, but to confront daily, boldly, with fists and philosophy alike. These 5 glimpses reveal not just a president, but a man on fire with purpose. Roosevelt didn't flirt with danger, he wrestled it. He didn't merely perform his role, he inhabited it, charging through life as if history were a frontier to be tamed. His oddities weren't random, they were extensions of a larger worldview, that life should be lived vigorously, joyfully, and without apology. And from this dynamo who boxed until blind and gave speeches with bullets in his chest, we now move to William Howard Taft, the man who got stuck in the White House bathtub, wrote legal opinions while soaking in hot water, and whose weight became a political obsession almost as heavy as the man himself. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, is often reduced to one enduring image, the man who got stuck in a bathtub. But while that anecdote might be the most frequently repeated, it barely scratches the surface of Taft's oddities. A man of immense physical presence, legal brilliance, and surprising softness, Taft's strangeness lay not in wild behavior, but in how profoundly he tried to balance dignity with discomfort, power with passivity, and protocol with personal peculiarities. Let's tackle the tub first, because yes, it happened. At over 300 pounds during his presidency, Taft required a custom-built bathtub installed in the White House, large enough to fit 4 grown men. The famous incident of him becoming stuck reportedly occurred on a naval ship before his presidency, and the crew had to use butter and manpower to free him. Embarrassing though it was, Taft handled it with self-deprecating humor and eventually leaned into the image, even joking about his presidential girth in private letters. Later, when asked if the new White House tub was comfortable, he replied, "It suits me perfectly. I can navigate freely." But Taft's bathing rituals didn't end with sighs. He had a habit of soaking for hours, sometimes composing legal arguments while reclining in hot water. He believed long baths stimulated his best thinking and would often delay meetings to finish a bath-bound train of thought. Some of his judicial opinions, later delivered from the Supreme Court bench, may have been born among soap bubbles and steam. Aides learned not to interrupt unless the situation was urgent and, even then he might ask, "Can it wait until the soak is finished?" Despite his discomfort with physical fitness routines, Taft had an unusual fondness for milk, consuming it in excessive quantities. He believed it aided digestion and weight loss, and once drank 20 glasses in a single day during an experimental milk diet. At one point, his entire dietary regimen consisted of warm milk, crackers, and weak tea. He consulted with multiple doctors over the years for weight issues, and one physician advised him to think of hunger as a political opponent and outwit it. Taft took the advice seriously, often talking himself out of snacks as if debating a bill in Congress. Another strange habit was his relationship with sleep. Taft was a chronic napper and could fall asleep mid-conversation, sometimes even mid-sentence. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to pause their conversations while the president snoozed in his chair, snoring softly, then resume once he startled back to wakefulness. During long speeches by others, he'd often nod off in plain view. Once, at a diplomatic function, he fell asleep while a foreign ambassador was delivering remarks directly to him. He later apologized, noting that his mind was willing, but his eyelids were not. Then there was his fear of public ridicule. Despite being a public figure, Taft refused to weigh himself in front of others and had a private scale built into the floor of his bathroom, hidden beneath a rug. Only his personal valet knew how to read it and record the results, which were then kept in a locked drawer. He had such a fraught relationship with his own image that he once declined to be photographed on horseback, fearing it would draw laughter. "I prefer to be seen upright and unmounted," he quipped. These 5 unusual habits and traits reveal a president who struggled with the physical constraints of his body while simultaneously reaching the highest levels of intellectual and judicial achievement. Taft wasn't wild like Roosevelt or haunted like Pierce. He was dignified, self-aware, and gently eccentric. His quirks weren't explosive, they were quietly human. And now, from a president who wrote legal opinions in the tub and snored through state functions, we move to Woodrow Wilson, man who drew moral maps of Europe by candlelight banned dancing in military barracks, and communicated policy ideas through dreams he believed were sent by God. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, was a man of fierce intellect, icy self-discipline, and deeply peculiar beliefs. Though widely known for leading the country through World War I and for crafting the League of Nations, Wilson's personal habits and psychological landscape were just as complex, marked by intense moral conviction, ritualistic behavior, and a near mystical relationship with dreams and destiny. Wilson believed his dreams were not just personal metaphors, but divine messages, policy blueprints handed down in symbolic form. He reportedly kept a journal of his dreams and often delayed decisions until he could sleep on it, sometimes literally. One night in 1918, after wrestling with the outline for his 14 points, he dreamed of standing in a library where all the books turned to blank pages. The next morning, he rewrote the speech's tone, claiming the dream revealed the world was waiting to be rewritten. This wasn't poetic flourish. Wilson truly believed that sleep was a conduit for higher purpose. He also had a strange compulsion to draw maps by candlelight. In his study, Wilson would often sketch imaginary borders and redrawn national boundaries, long before he helped reshape post-war Europe. His candlelit cartography became a nightly ritual. He believed that artificial light interfered with creativity, and only the flicker of flame allowed his moral compass to activate. Some of these maps, preserved by aides, show alternate versions of Europe, Asia, even America, some idealistic, others almost dystopian. Wilson's puritanical streak extended to culture and recreation. He banned dancing in U.S. military barracks during World War I, calling it a moral distraction to the martial soul. He believed physical indulgence weakened national will and that music and movement should serve patriotic or religious functions only. Soldiers caught dancing were reprimanded, and military band leaders were instructed to avoid sensual rhythms. It was part of Wilson's broader belief that personal behavior and national destiny were intertwined. Another of his oddities was his habit of eating with extreme speed. Wilson could consume an entire meal in less than 10 minutes, and often did so in total silence. He believed lingering at the table invited idle talk and moral drift. He once startled foreign dignitaries by finishing his meal before most had begun. An aide joked that dining with Wilson was like eating during a fire drill. Despite his elitist aura, he preferred plain food, boiled eggs, toast, milk, and rice. Gourmet meals annoyed him, and he called fancy desserts sins dressed in sugar. Then there was his obsession with clocks, especially those he could not control. Wilson demanded that all clocks in the White House be synchronized to Naval Observatory time, and he routinely checked their accuracy. He kept a pocket watch on him at all times, and grew agitated if meetings started even a minute late. Yet paradoxically, he refused to wear wristwatches, calling them juvenile ornaments. Time, to Wilson, was both a spiritual discipline and a symbol of moral order. More thing, like the world, he believed he was born to fix. These 5 glimpses into Wilson's strange world show a president whose mind moved between theological certainty and bureaucratic micromanagement. He was not just a leader, he was a self-anointed prophet of progress, convinced his mission was preordained. His eccentricities were expressions of that inner sense of destiny, sharpened by tragedy, brilliance, and self-imposed isolation. And now, from a president who drew maps by candlelight and banned dancing in the name of moral discipline, we turn to Warren G. Harding, a man whose cabinet was a crime scene, who read horoscopes in bed, gambled away priceless White House items, and once kept a psychic on retainer to advise him on foreign policy. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, is often remembered for the scandals that consumed his administration, but behind the headlines and the corruption was a man steeped in mysticism, addiction to risk, and one of the most bizarre inner circles ever assembled in presidential history. Harding was not just unlucky in the people he trusted, he was, in many ways, a man led more by astrology and charm than by policy or principle. Let's begin with one of the most outlandish aspects of his presidency. Harding employed a psychic as an informal advisor. This medium, Madame Marcia, regularly sent him astrological readings and advice on foreign policy, personal choices, and public appearances. Harding took her seriously, often adjusting his travel schedule or timing speeches based on her celestial warnings. He once postponed a crucial cabinet meeting due to a dangerous planetary alignment cited in one of her letters. White House staff were aware of her influence, but few dared question it, fearing Harding's belief that the stars never lie. At night, Harding was known to read horoscopes in bed, not just for himself, but for friends and cabinet members. He claimed that the zodiac gave him clarity that logic alone could not provide. His personal library included dozens of books on astrology, spiritualism, and the occult positioned alongside biographies of Napoleon and founding fathers, as though he saw himself as a cosmic participant in America's fate. But it wasn't all stars and spirits. Harding had an incurable addiction to gambling. He loved poker, and not just casual games. He played with his inner circle inside the White House, often wagering valuable items. Once, in a moment of poor judgment, he gambled away an entire set of White House china during a late-night poker game. When news of this reached the press, it was spun into a joke, but the loss was real. Harding's friends, dubbed the Ohio Gang, were infamous for these games, where bourbon flowed freely and deals both political and personnel were struck over aces and cigars. Harding also had one of the strangest obsessions with press secrecy. Though he had worked as a newspaper editor and was famously friendly with journalists, he refused to be photographed while eating. He said it made him feel like an animal at a zoo. On state visits, photographers were instructed to lower their cameras during meals, and in one instance, a photojournalist was banned for life after snapping a candid of Harding mid-bite. For a man obsessed with public image, even chewing could be a liability. Perhaps most unsettling was his private behavior during public ceremonies. Harding had a habit of whispering affirmations to himself, short, cryptic mantras that sounded like fragments of sermons or ancient texts. Guests near him during these events would sometimes overhear words like golden gate, golden fate, or stones remember, water forgets. Whether these were personal mottos, lines from the psychic, or stress rituals is unclear, but they gave an air of eerie detachment to an otherwise jovial presence. These 5 facts reveal a president whose inner world was ruled less by law than by luck, fate, and intuition. Harding didn't simply govern, he drifted, often guided by gamblers, mystics, and backroom loyalty rather than reason or structure. His White House was less an office and more a parlor where fortunes rose and fell over poker chips and planetary alignments. And now, from a president who whispered riddles and lost state china over cards, we descend into the silent storm of Calvin Coolidge, a man who believed silence was a weapon, who pressed elevator buttons just to watch them light up, and who once shocked a butler by calmly saying, "You lose," after hiding for hours behind a door. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, the 30th President of the United States, was a paradox in a tailored suit. A man so quiet, he earned the nickname Silent Cal, yet whose deadpan behavior, prankish instincts, and ritualistic routines made him one of the most bizarre and unexpectedly hilarious figures to ever occupy the Oval Office. Behind the frozen expression and sparse words was a mind that delighted in surreal discipline, cryptic jokes, and psychological warfare through sheer stillness. Coolidge's most famous oddity, of course, was his silence. He once famously responded to a dinner guest challenge, "I bet I can get more than 2 words out of you," with the reply, "You lose." But this wasn't just public persona, it was private habit. Coolidge often sat through entire meetings without saying a word, sometimes nodding once, sometimes not at all. If aides became uncomfortable, he considered the silence successful. One staffer recalled spending 15 minutes explaining a bill, only for Coolidge to blink, stand up, and leave the room without comment. Only later did the staffer learn the president had approved Ith, just didn't feel the need to say so. That same sense of minimalism extended to his physical behavior. Coolidge had a peculiar fascination with elevator buttons. He enjoyed riding the White House elevator alone, pressing the buttons repeatedly just to watch them light up, despite only one floor being in use. This wasn't absent-mindedness, it was quiet amusement. He once told an aide, "The best part of being president is nobody tells you not to press things." These solo rides became regular rituals, little islands of childlike mischief in a sea of national governance. He also had a habit of playing subtle pranks, often involving complete stillness. On more than one occasion, Coolidge would hide behind doors and remain silent for long periods just to observe reactions. Once, a butler opened a closet and found Coolidge standing there motionless, having waited almost an hour. The president's only response, "You lose." He wasn't trying to scare, he was testing awareness, or perhaps just amusing himself with anti-theatrics. For Coolidge, the absence of sound was more powerful than any speech. His dietary preferences were no less peculiar. He enjoyed breakfast in bed, but not just toast and tea. His favorite morning treat was a bowl of dry cereal soaked in Coca-Cola. The bubbles made the flakes dance, he said, which he found oddly calming. He also insisted on eating it in complete silence, often behind a newspaper so even the butler wouldn't make eye contact. Mealtime, to Coolidge, was a sacred meditation. Coolidge also had a strange bedtime ritual involving his pet raccoon, named Rebecca. Unlike Roosevelt's free-range badgers or Grant's roaming ferret, Coolidge had Rebecca trained to walk on a leash. She was originally intended to be served at Thanksgiving, but Coolidge spared her and made her a presidential pet instead. Before bed, he would walk Rebecca through the halls of the White House, whispering short lines of poetry aloud. He claimed it helped him unwind his mind, though aides were not allowed to hear which verses he recited. Guests who encountered the duo in the darkened halls often assumed they were hallucinating. These 5 oddities paint a picture of a man not merely quiet, but ritualistic, methodical, and deeply amused by the absurdity of power. Coolidge's silence wasn't emptiness, it was control. He didn't just wield authority through wordshy weaponized pauses, stillness, and the unpredictable mechanics of his own personality. And from this ghost of a man who ruled with muttered poems and silent pranks, we turn to Herbert Hoover, an engineer-president who micromanaged the White House flower arrangements, stockpiled 500 pairs of identical socks, and once designed a vacuum-powered fruit washer for his own apples. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States, is often remembered as the man in office during the onset of the Great Depression, but his strange and meticulous personal life tells a far more curious story. Hoover was not flamboyant like Roosevelt or cryptic like Coolidge. He was an engineer through and through. And that scientific mind extended to almost every aspect of his daily existence, resulting in some of the most uniquely odd presidential habits in American history. To begin with, Hoover had an obsession with socks, but not variety. He owned over 500 pairs of the exact same kind, black, wool, medium thickness, and made by a specific tailor in London. He insisted on this uniformity because, as he once wrote, "Thinking about socks is a waste of time." In his closet, each pair was numbered and stored in air-sealed containers, labeled by month. He rotated them systematically. The man who grappled with global economic collapse didn't want a single moment wasted on mismatched hosiery. His compulsions didn't end at the ankle. Hoover had an aversion to unfiltered air, especially around food. He designed a custom ventilation system for the White House dining room to circulate purified air while he ate, convinced that airborne impurities could alter taste and mood. He also insisted that flowers be removed from dining tables before meals, believing their pollen interfered with digestion. White House chefs and decorators quickly learned to adapt, clearing arrangements in near-silent coordination before he arrived. Then, there was his fruit wash-era vacuum-powered device Hoover invented and kept in the White House kitchen, used exclusively to clean apples. He was obsessed with apples and ate one nearly every day, but believed standard washing methods were inadequate. His contraption used suction and pressure to clean the fruit without bruising it. He personally calibrated the settings and once gave a detailed 20-minute explanation of the device to an Austrian ambassador who had merely asked for a slice of fruit. Hoover's relationship with sound was equally bizarre. He despised background noise and installed rubber padding beneath carpets and furniture in his personal quarters to reduce echoes. During meetings, he preferred heavy curtains closed and windows sealed. He said noise stirred the thoughts too quickly and favored a library, like atmosphere, in nearly all his rooms. On particularly stressful days, he would retreat to a small soundproof chamber he had built an office within an office where he would sit in silence for 15 minutes, staring at blank walls to reset his mental equipment. And perhaps most telling of all was his habit of micromanaging flower arrangements. Hoover believed the placement, height, and symmetry of flowers reflected the mood of a room and, by extension, the state of the nation. He had staff present 3 arrangement options each morning, and he would personally choose one, occasionally rearranging stems with gloved hands. He once delayed a diplomatic brunch by 20 minutes because the tulips were angled too aggressively. These weren't passing preferences, they were daily rituals. These 5 facts reveal a man whose mind never stopped calculating, optimizing, and controlling. Hoover didn't just engineer buildings or organize famine. Relief, he tried to engineer the atmosphere of his presidency, right down to the socks on his feet and the air he breathed with every bite. While history often casts him in grayscale, his peculiarities are vivid, tactile reminders that even the most rational minds are rarely free from irrational rituals. And now, from a president who vacuum-washed apples and feared the chaos of tulips, we enter the surreal landscape of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man who kept secret the full extent of his paralysis, hosted cocktail hours during war councils, and once invited a psychic to the White House to contact his dead dog. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, is often lionized as the steady hand who led America through the Great Depression and World War II. But behind the commanding radio voice and cigarette holder grin was a deeply theatrical, secretive, and delightfully strange Manon who blurred the line between showmanship and statesmanship, all while concealing one of the greatest physical deceptions in presidential history. First, there was the carefully orchestrated illusion of mobility. Stricken with polio in 1921, Roosevelt was left permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Yet, during his presidency, the public rarely saw him in a wheelchair. He devised an intricate choreography of appearances, braces hidden beneath tailored trousers, walking sticks, and the arm of a strong aide allowed him to walk in carefully staged settings. His wheelchair was custom-built to resemble a dining chair with wheels, and photographers were forbidden from capturing images that revealed his full disability. One reporter who defied this was banned for life. The deception wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Roosevelt believed that projecting strength was essential to national morale, and he guarded the truth of his condition as fiercely as any state secret. Then there was his obsession with cocktail hour. No matter the crises swirling outside the Oval Office, Roosevelt insisted on a nightly social gathering dubbed the Little White House Happy Hour. These events were mandatory for staff and guests alike, and politics were banned as a topic of conversation. Roosevelt would mix drinks personally, usually with terrible proportions, tell off-color jokes, and sometimes insist that guests sing or play charades. The tradition served as both stress relief and control, allowing him to observe allies and rivals in a disarmed, informal setting. According to his son James, no one could say no to Father's cocktail hour. Not Churchill, Not Stalin, not even the bomb. Roosevelt also had a strange spiritual side. He once invited a psychic medium to the White House to contact the spirit of Falahi's beloved Scottish Terrier who had recently passed. Fala had been more than a pet. He was a public relations phenomenon, featured in speeches and photos and even receiving fan mail. When Fala died, Roosevelt was devastated. According to staff, he spent several evenings speaking to the dog's portrait and kept a lock of Fala's fur in his desk. The séance was never publicly acknowledged, but notes from the session stored among Roosevelt's private papers indicate that he found comfort in hearing Fala's presence once more. Another lesser-known quirk was Roosevelt's love of cryptic games and riddles. He often wrote coded messages to his grandchildren and challenged aides to solve puzzles before cabinet meetings. He delighted in double meanings and once sent Winston Churchill a telegram written entirely in rhyming verse. During one particularly stressful week in 1942, Roosevelt replaced a military strategy map with a crossword puzzle and told his generals, "Solve this first. It will sharpen your thinking." Whether the gesture was playful or a test of temperament, no one dared protest. Finally, there was his obsession with collecting stamps, a hobby that followed him into the White House and never waned. Roosevelt believed stamps reflected world history in miniature, and he often retreated to his collection late at night to unwind. He had a special desk fitted for sorting and mounting stamps, and even as bombs fell in Europe, he might spend an hour pondering the design of a Dutch colonial issue. He approved new stamp designs personally, and once joked that if he hadn't been president, I'd have been Postmaster General and far happier for it. These 5 strange and revealing habits paint Roosevelt as a man who understood the power of image, ritual, and illusion. He was part magician, part monarch, part uncle, and part warrior, using laughter, secrecy, and a touch of the occult to govern a country on the brink. His strangeness was not escapism, it was theater for survival. And now, from a president who hid paralysis behind performance and toasted ghosts at cocktail hour, we step into the quiet, private world of Harry S. Truman, a man who woke at 5 a.m. to play piano scales, cursed like a sailor in private letters, and once threatened to punch a music critic for insulting his daughter. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was perhaps the most ordinary man ever to assume the president's ordinary, that is, in background, demeanor, and appearance. But beneath the plain-spoken exterior and Midwestern modesty was a deeply peculiar, emotionally combustible figure with habits and reactions that could veer from touching to truly strange. Truman began each day with a regimented ritual, piano scales at dawn. He would rise at exactly 5 a.m. and sit down to practice classical piano, regardless of how tense the world situation was. This was no idle hobby. Truman had once seriously considered becoming a concert pianist. He believed the routine disciplined his mind and prepared him for the stresses of leadership. He had a baby grand piano installed in the White House and would sometimes play for visiting dignitaries. One aide described these early morning recitals as less about the music, more about the battle with chaos. Despite his public image as a no-nonsense leader, Truman had an explosive temper, especially in private letters. He frequently cursed, insulted, and lashed out at critics with surprising venom. His favorite targets were journalists and cultural commentators, none more so than the music critic who gave his daughter Margaret a poor performance review. Truman's response? A handwritten letter to the critic stating, "I've never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose, and plenty of beefsteak, and perhaps a supporter below." The letter was leaked and shocked the nation, but Truman refused to apologize. "I'm just a daddy," he shrugged. "And you mess with my girl, you mess with me." He was also obsessed with walking specifically, walking at an exact pace. Every day, without fail, Truman would take a brisk 1.5-mile walk through Washington, D.C., swinging his arms so forcefully that locals joked you could set your watch by him. He walked so regularly, and predictably, that tourists would line up just to see him pass. If interrupted during his route, Truman became visibly annoyed and would often double back to make up the lost distance. He claimed it was the best cabinet meeting I ever had. Truman also had a very strange relationship with the White House ghosts. Though he didn't believe in them, he heard them. Loud footsteps, creaking floors, and knocking on doors kept him up at night. In letters to his wife, Bess, he described feeling watched and even claimed that one ghost, possibly Abraham Lincoln, had brushed against him. "The damned place is haunted, sure as shooting," he wrote. But rather than move or seek explanations, Truman simply started talking back. "All right, General," he reportedly said once while writing a speech, "give me a better idea." One of his strangest quirks was his obsession with clothing symmetry. Truman would change shirts multiple times a day if they didn't lay perfectly flat across his shoulders. He despised rumples, wrinkles, or collars that flared. He owned more than 70 nearly identical boaties and 60 pairs of glasses, rotating them like military units to ensure one was always ready. When reporters teased him about his wardrobe parade, he said only, "There's a uniform for every fight, and I'm in the middle of one every day." These strange, revealing details show a president who, beneath the simple speech and clipped glasses, was full of fire, rhythm, and ritual. Truman didn't mask his quirks; he wore them proudly, like the creased lines on his suit. He wasn't trying to be presidential in the traditional sense. He was trying to be real, and if that meant threatening a critic, marching through town like clockwork, or arguing with Lincoln's ghost at midnight, so be it. And now, from a president who swung his fists for family and talked back to dead presidents, we turn to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the war hero who banned squirrels from the White House lawn, painted still lifes to relax, and had a secret obsession with cooking, especially steak that no one else was allowed to touch. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States, was a 5-star general, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, and the architect of day. But when he stepped into the civilian role of president, Ike revealed a different set of skills and some truly strange personal habits that made his time in the White House a little more peculiar than history often credits. Let's begin with the squirrels. Eisenhower loathed them. While most presidents tolerated or even welcomed the scampering creatures on the White House lawn, Ike considered them a menace, particularly because they were constantly digging up the putting green he had installed for his beloved golf practice. Eventually, he ordered the Secret Service to trap and remove the squirrels, dispatching them to far-off parks. Dozens were relocated in what came to be known, unofficially, as the White House Squirrel Purge. When the press got wind of it, Eisenhower shrugged and said, "I worked hard for that green." Golf wasn't just a hobby, it was a presidential necessity. Eisenhower played over 800 rounds of golf during his 2 terms, often using the game to clear his head or conduct informal diplomacy. But he had a superstition about playing with the same ball too long. He believed that a ball that played well in one round would betray him in the next. His valet was tasked with rotating fresh golf balls into circulation every few days, and each used ball was cataloged, dated, and stored because you never knew when you might need a lucky one. Then there was Eisenhower's unlikely passion for painting. After the war, Ike took up art as a form of stress relief, producing hundreds of still lifes, landscapes, and portraits. He would often spend evenings in a private room with brushes and canvases, trying to replicate the work of famous painters like Rembrandt and Van Gogh. He once painted a portrait of Abraham Lincoln from memory and said, "Painting is like planning a battle, except the enemy is boredom." While his paintings were never celebrated critically, he took them seriously and even gifted them to friends and dignitaries. Ike's love of cooking was even more intense and, strangely, territorial. He was particularly obsessed with making the perfect steak. Though the White House had world-class chefs, Eisenhower insisted on cooking steaks himself on a custom-made electric grill he kept in the kitchen. He had a personal steak fork and would allow no one to touch the meat during preparation. He had elaborate rituals, brushing each side with a secret garlic blend, turning it exactly once, and allowing it to rest precisely 3 minutes before cutting. "This," he said once while slicing into a New York strip, "is how democracy tastes." Eisenhower was also unusually strict about bed-making. Despite being commander-in-chief, he made his own bed every morning, military corners, tight sheets, and all. He believed that making the bed set the tone for the entire day. If a maid touched it before he did, he would remake it from scratch. He once gave a full tutorial to a visiting senator on proper blanket folding. "Win the first battle," he said, "and the others come easier." These 5 oddities reveal a man who, though revered as a stoic war hero, was deeply tactile, ritualistic, and driven by an internal order as rigid as any military formation. Eisenhower didn't just lead army-esh, led his breakfast, his golf game, and his bed linens with the same no-nonsense discipline. His quirks weren't distractions. They were anchor points in a life that had once teetered on the edge of global annihilation. And now, from a general who cooked steak-like strategy and waged war against squirrels, we move on to John F. Kennedy, a president who swam naked in the White House pool, wore a back brace under every suit, and kept a secret stash of coconut husks that once saved his life. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, remains one of the most iconic figures in American political history. Young, charismatic, and mythologized by his tragic end. But beneath the polished speeches and photo-perfect smile was a man riddled with health problems, unconventional habits, and a personal life so bizarre at times that even those closest to him were often left baffled. Kennedy's public image was tightly controlled, but his private eccentricities painted a far stranger picture. Let's begin with one of the most enduring symbols of his survival: coconut husks. After his Navy patrol boat, PT-109, was destroyed in the Pacific during World War II, Kennedy swam miles through shark-infested waters, towing an injured crew member by a life vest strap clenched in his teeth. Eventually, stranded on an island with no radio, Kennedy carved a rescue message onto a coconut husk and gave it to local islanders to deliver to U.S. forces. That coconut was later encased in glass and displayed on his desk in the Oval Office. He would often pick it up absent-mindedly during meetings, using it as a sort of stress talisman, holding the literal symbol of life or death in his hands while discussing Cold War brinkmanship. Kennedy also had a secret pool ritual, swimming naked in the White House pool. Though rarely discussed during his lifetime, it was an open secret among staff. He swam almost daily, sometimes alone, sometimes with aides or close female acquaintances. It was his escape not just from political pressure, but from physical pain. Kennedy suffered from chronic back problems, so severe he often required assistance to put on his clothes. Floating weightlessly in the water was one of the few times he felt free of agony. But modesty was not part of the ritual. He considered clothing in the pool inefficient. That back pain was hidden from the public with great effort and a steel back brace worn under nearly every suit. The brace kept him upright during speeches, but it came at a strange cost. Doctors later theorized that the brace worn even on the day of his assassination prevented him from collapsing after the first bullet in Dallas, keeping him rigid and upright for the fatal second shot. Even his method of standing became part of the tragic enigma. Kennedy also had a peculiar fixation with rocking chairs. He owned dozens and had them placed in nearly every room he frequented, from the Oval Office to Camp David. The motion soothed his back pain, and he insisted on taking his personal rocker with him on Air Force One. He often held meetings while rocking rhythmically, leading some foreign diplomats to wonder if it was a power play or simply a distraction. It was neither. It was pain management disguised as casual elegance. And then there was his compulsive doodling. While appearing poised and presidential, Kennedy often scrawled endless loops, cubes, and fragmented words during meetings. Some of these doodles were preserved and later revealed chilling entries like crisis, enemy, and if it ends. Others were cryptic, initials in boxes, strange shapes, or repetitions of the word why. They weren't absent-minded, they were pressure valves. Kennedy's mind never stopped moving, and his pen seemed to serve as a lightning rod for that internal storm. These 5 strange facts reveal a president who was constantly at war with his body, his image, and the momentous pressures of the nuclear age. Kennedy's life was a performance of vitality, hiding physical fragility, of control, masking chaos. His eccentricities weren't signs of indulgence, they were symptoms of a man who had seen death, dodged it, and knew deep down that he might not dodge it forever. And now, from a man who swam naked with history and balanced his spine with steel, we enter the shadowy, secretive world of Lyndon B. Johnson, a president who gave interviews from the toilet, demanded new shower heads that blasted like fire hoses, and measured staff loyalty by how quickly they fetched him Fresca. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, was a whirlwind of power, profanity, and unapologetic oddity. Towering in personality and physical presence, LBJ governed not just with legislative muscle, but with a deeply personal, often invasive style that blurred the lines between leadership, domination, and theater. His eccentricities weren't side notes, they were his operating system. Perhaps the most infamous of all was his habit of giving interviews and instructions while on the toilet. Johnson installed a special phone near his bathroom in the White House and frequently summoned aides mid-defecation, barking orders with the door wide open. He once signed a bill while seated on the toilet, and, when an aide hesitated to enter, Johnson shouted, "What's the matter? Haven't you ever seen your president take a crap?" He believed informality was honesty and he weaponized it. His obsession with plumbing extended to the bizarre. Johnson demanded custom shower heads in the White House that sprayed water with such force they could strip paint. No existing fixture satisfied him, so plumbers had to design a special contraption that delivered multi-angle jets and extremely high pressure. LBJ described the desired sensation as, like being under a Texas thunderstorm. Once installed, he insisted every guest bathroom be equipped with similar System 7 if guests didn't want them. Then there was his loyalty test involving Fresca. Johnson adored the grapefruit soda and drank it constantly. He expected aides to keep cans of it on hand at all times. A staffer's reliability was, at least in part, judged by how quickly they could produce a cold Fresca when asked. If you hesitated, your future in the Johnson administration was in question. Aides joked that policy meetings sometimes stalled until a can of Fresca arrived. Fresca diplomacy, they called it. LBJ also had a unique relationship with his body and others. He was notorious for holding meetings while changing clothes, lifting his shirt to show his gallbladder surgery scar, or, in some cases, urinating outdoors while continuing conversations. On one occasion, he relieved himself on his ranch while speaking with a reporter, turning his back briefly, then continuing the interview midstream. He explained, "It's all natural. Might as well get used to it." It was shocking, calculated, and unmistakably Johnson. But beyond the bluster, there was a deeply unusual intimacy in how Johnson handled relationships. He would corner people physically leaning inches from their face, gripping their shoulder, and whispering political threats or praise in the same drawled breath. This technique became known as the Johnson treatment, a psychological ambush that overwhelmed opponents with charm, volume, and claustrophobia. Few could resist it. He'd quote scripture, brag about Texas, or shame someone's ancestors sometimes, all in the same sentence until they folded. These 5 strange behaviors reveal a president who used his eccentricities as both armor and weapon. Johnson wasn't afraid to be crude, weird, or deeply personal. In fact, he embraced it. To him, politics wasn't a polite game, it was trench warfare. And every tactic, no matter how bizarre, was fair. And now, from the thunder-showered, toilet-dictating, fresca-demanding force that was LBJ, we descend into the haunted, paranoid world of Richard Nixon, man who talked to portraits, recorded everyone but trusted no one, and once paced the White House lawn alone in the middle of the night, asking the sky if he was still loved. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, was one of the most psychologically complex figures ever to hold the office, a man driven by insecurity and ambition, paranoia and perfectionism. While his downfall in the Watergate scandal remains the most infamous chapter of his presidency, Nixon's personal world was equally strange, shrouded in secrecy, haunted by ghosts both real and imagined, and marked by habits that bordered on the surreal. One of Nixon's most unsettling quirks was his tendency to talk to the portraits of past presidents, especially Abraham Lincoln. Late at night, often after consuming several glasses of scotch, he would wander the White House halls, stopping in front of Lincoln's painting and speaking aloud, sometimes pleading, sometimes arguing. Aides recalled hearing Nixon mutter, "What would you do, Abe?" Or, "You had your war, I've got mine." These conversations weren't always rhetorical. Nixon believed the presidency was a kind of spiritual lineage and he needed the ghosts on his side. His sense of being watched, judged, or betrayed was no metaphor. Nixon famously bugged the White House, recording thousands of hours of conversations, including his own private musings. But his surveillance didn't stop at politics. He even had devices placed near the swimming pool and in guest rooms, fearing leaks or disloyalty from staff and allies. The irony? He trusted no one, yet recorded everything. And the recordings, meant to protect him, became his greatest undoing. He also had a ritual of pacing the White House lawn alone, usually after midnight, sometimes in a trench coat, sometimes in formal wear, always deep in rumination. Secret Service agents followed at a discreet distance as Nixon walked for hours under the moonlight. One night in 1970, he summoned a limo to take him to the Lincoln Memorial, where he struck up a spontaneous 4 a.m. conversation with anti-war protesters. He rambled about football, Latin, and peace. They were baffled. He was moved. No policy changed. It was the logic of loneliness. Then there was his obsession with milk plain, cold milk, served in glass bottles with a straw. He drank it multiple times a day, believing it settled the stomach and steadied the nerves. He had it stocked aboard Air Force One, and any trip without milk was considered a logistical failure. He refused coffee, alcohol, except privately, or soda, just milk. A Secret Service agent once joked that if nuclear war broke out, Nixon's first question would be, "Is there milk in the bunker?" Nixon was also terrified of hospitals. When injured or ill, he avoided doctors as long as possible. During a campaign in the 1960s, he hit his head on a car door, causing a large gash. Instead of seeking treatment, he had his staff patch it up with butterfly bandages and continued with a bloody scalp beneath his hat. He associated hospitals with weakness, and even after being diagnosed with phlebitis, he resisted surgery for months. Control over his body, like over his image, his aides, his enemies, was absolute until it wasn't. These 5 strange facts reveal Nixon as a man at constant war with the world, with history, and most of all, with himself. His eccentricities weren't performative. They were protective measures for a soul that feared collapse, even in victory. Nixon didn't just distrust she distrusted reality. And so, he built his own, one tape, one ghost, one glass of milk at a time. And now, from a president who whispered to Lincoln and stalked the shadows of his own mind, we move to Gerald Ford, a man who fell downstairs, golfed in nearly every photo op, and once tried to feed his dog on live television, only to end up with mashed potatoes on his suit and a nation charmed by his clumsiness. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, came into office under unprecedented circumstances appointed Vice President, ascending to the presidency after Nixon's resignation, and trying to restore trust in a shaken nation. He was honest, affable, and physically robust. But despite his background as a college football star, Ford became unintentionally famous for one of the strangest presidential reputations of all. He couldn't stop falling down. Ford's clumsiness became a national joke, especially after a series of highly publicized stumbles down the steps of Air Force One, on a ski slope in Austria, and even in the White House. Cameras seemed to catch every slip, trip, and awkward lunge. The truth? Ford was actually one of the most athletic presidents in history. He played football for the University of Michigan and turned down offers from the NFL. But a bum knee from his playing days sometimes gave out at the worst moments, and the timing was so unlucky that Saturday Night Live built an entire character around it. Ford took it in stride, once joking, "I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." And then there was the mashed potato incident. During a live television segment meant to show his down-to-earth persona, Ford attempted to feed his dog, Liberty, a golden retriever beloved by the public. The plan was simple. Pour kibble into a bowl, give the dog a pat, wave to America. But instead, he dropped the scoop, accidentally tipped a bowl of mashed potatoes onto his lap, and Liberty started licking his suit before the cameras cut away. The incident made headlines and charmed the country, reinforcing his image as the accident-prone everyman. Ford also had a golf obsession known so strong that it practically defined his public appearances. He played over 800 rounds during his presidency, and once hit a spectator with a wayward drive during a Pro-Am tournament. Ford's swing was powerful but wildly inaccurate, prompting comedian Bob Hope to quip, "It's not hard to spot President Ford's ballots, the one that's bouncing off a Secret Service agent." Ford responded with a grin and kept swinging. The game was his therapy, his diplomacy, and sometimes his unintended weapon. In private, Ford was extremely superstitious about pens. He believed that signing legislation with a pen that had previously written something negative could carry bad luck into the new law. As a result, he insisted on using brand new pens for every bill, sometimes discarding multiple pens until one felt right. He would tap each pen on the desk before using it with sand, occasionally ask aides to de-jinx them by wiping them with a clean cloth. The ritual was quiet, rarely noticed, but always practiced. Another strange quirk was Ford's insistence on sleeping with the windows open, regardless of weather. Even in winter, he preferred freezing bedrooms to what he called the stagnation of sealed air. At Camp David, staff would scramble to adjust the thermostat or layer blankets after he passed out with icy gusts pouring in. He believed cold air made for sharper dreams and often woke up quoting snippets of conversations or song lyrics that had popped into his head overnight. These 5 strange facts paint a picture of a president who wasn't mystical or paranoid like his predecessor, nor mythologized like his successor, but instead profoundly human. Ford's oddities were endearing rather than alarming, physical rather than psychological, and always carried with them a hint of humility. He tripped, he spilled, he sliced balls into crowds, but he laughed, got up, and kept going. And now, from a president who stumbled through history with mashed potatoes and a golden retriever, we head into the cerebral, solar-powered, peanut farming world of Jimmy Carter, a man who banned nuclear weapons from prayer, tracked UFOs, and once saved a nuclear reactor with nothing but math and a wrench. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, was a deeply devout, technically brilliant, and profoundly unique mana peanut farmer, turned nuclear physicist, turned commander-in-chief, who brought a mix of Southern modesty and scientific precision to the White House. But Carter's presidency and his personality was filled with strange habits, mystical convictions, and quietly legendary moments that still defy easy categorization. One of the most bizarre and frequently overlooked episodes in Carter's life happened long before his presidency, when he was serving in the U.S. Navy. In 1952, a Canadian nuclear reactor at Chalk River suffered a partial meltdown. Carter, then a nuclear engineer, was part of the American cleanup team. He and his team had to enter the radioactive core in 90-second intervals, performing rapid deconstruction and decontamination tasks. Before entering, Carter and his crew practiced their every move on a full-scale wooden replica of the facility. Once inside the reactor, exposure was so intense that Carter reportedly peed radioactive urine for months. He later said the experience gave him a unique perspective on risk and the importance of restraint in using nuclear power. Carter also claimed to have seen a UFO. In 1969, he spotted a bright, glowing object in the Georgia sky that changed colors and hovered for 10 minutes before shooting off into the distance. He reported the incident to the International UFO Bureau and later recounted it, often though skeptically, never claiming it was alien. Still, it marked him as one of the few U.S. presidents to file an official UFO report. When he ran for president, he promised to open all government UFO files. Once in office, he reportedly reviewed the classified materials but declined to release them, allegedly citing national security concerns. The contradiction only added to the mystery. As president, Carter made waves by installing solar panels on the White House roof in 1979, decades ahead of the mainstream climate movement. He proudly declared that renewable energy would be the path forward for America, and symbolically had solar-heated water used in the White House kitchen. After he left office, Ronald Reagan had the panels removed. Years later, they were rediscovered in a government warehouse and became artifacts of Carter's futuristic and, at the time, ridiculed vision. Carter's deeply religious lifestyle also led to one of the strangest intersections of faith and geopolitics. He prayed for nuclear disarmament with a handwritten list of every known warhead. According to aides, Carter maintained a personal prayer list that included not just world leaders in crises, but an updated tally of nuclear weapons by country. He would sometimes take the list into the White House chapel and pray over each number. "One less tomorrow," he reportedly whispered during one such vigil. He also refused to take communion if he had authorized new weapons development that week. And then there was his addiction to self-discipline. Carter was notorious for micromanage, even signing off on the White House tennis court schedule. He would rise at 5 a.m. to read classified briefings alone, annotating them with longhand notes in neat margins. Aides once said his morning briefings resembled college term papers filled with underlines, rhetorical questions, and requests for sources. He logged every expenditure, personally reviewed staff timesheets, and even did his own laundry at Camp David. These 5 strange facts reveal a president who fused faith and science, prayer and planning, vision and vigilance. Carter didn't bluff, didn't posture, and didn't hide his oddities. They were part of his character, as unshakable as his grin and as specific as the number of missiles he wished would disappear. He wasn't a showman, he was a technician of peace, a prophet with a wrench, and a man who tried to heal the world with spreadsheets and psalms. And now, from a president who tracked UFOs and saved a nuclear reactor in under 2 minutes, we move to Ronald Reagan, man who read his daily horoscope before military briefings, believed trees caused pollution, and once joked during a live mic check that he had just outlawed Russia and bombing would begin in 5 minutes. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, was a Hollywood actor turned politician, a gifted communicator known as the Great Communicator, but behind the stagecraft and stirring speeches was a man who ruled the country with a mix of charisma, charm, and more than a little mysticism. Reagan's presidency was shaped not only by Cold War policies and economic shifts, but also by personal superstitions, showbiz instincts, and some genuinely strange habits that blur the line between reality and script. Perhaps the most notorious of these was his reliance on astrology. After the 1,000 981 assassination attempt on his life, Reagan's wife, Nancy, hired an astrologer named Joan Quigley to help chart the stars and guide the president's schedule. Quigley advised on everything from the timing of Air Force One departures to speech days and press briefings. Reagan never publicly acknowledged the influence, but Chief of Staff Ronald Reagan later revealed that the astrologer's readings determined virtually every major move and decision. Meetings were postponed, state visits rescheduled, and major announcements delayed, all because Mercury was in retrograde. Then there was Reagan's bizarre declaration that trees cause pollution. During a speech in 1981, Reagan claimed, "Trees cause more pollution than automobiles do." The statement drew widespread ridicule and confusion, but Reagan doubled down, citing studies on methane emissions from plants. Critics mocked him as anti-environmental, but Reagan insisted he was only questioning the science. The quote stuck and became symbolic of his odd, occasionally off-the-cuff relationship with scientific facts. Reagan also had a peculiar habit of mixing reality with old movie plots. Friends and aides often noted that he'd refer to fictional characters or scenes as though they were real-life events. During World War II remembrances, he would sometimes recount moments that actually came from war films he had narrated, not from military service he never saw combat. His speeches were peppered with quotes from westerns, dramas, and propaganda films. One aide said, "He could remember the ending to every film he ever starred in, but not always which ones were true." And then there was the infamous, "I have just outlawed Russia" gaffe. During a 1984 microphone soundcheck before a radio address, Reagan joked, "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." The remark, made off the cuff, was captured by a live mic and nearly sparked panic internationally. While clearly intended as a joke, it came at a time of high Cold War tension and was not received with much humor abroad. The Soviets were not amused and reportedly moved military units to alert status for several hours. Despite the gravitas of his role, Reagan also kept a deep childlike enthusiasm for jelly beans. He consumed them obsessively, especially black licorice flavor. He had jars of them in the Oval Office, aboard Air Force One, and at cabinet meetings. During tense moments, he'd offer jelly beans to staff or visiting dignitaries as an icebreaker. The candy became so associated with him that the Jelly Belly Company created a custom presidential mix and supplied 3.5 tons for his 1981 inauguration. These 5 strange facts show that Reagan's presidency was more than speeches and policies. It was performance, instinct, and ritual. He governed with optimism wrapped in superstition, humor steeped in myth, and a worldview shaped as much by Hollywood's backlot as by Washington's corridors. Whether quoting cowboys or consulting star charts, Reagan remained, to the very end, a man playing the greatest role of his life. And now, from a jelly bean-toting star who joked about nuclear war and let the stars align his calendar, we move on to George H.W. Bush, a president who vomited on foreign dignitaries, skydived into retirement, and once waged war against a supermarket scanner that refused to scan his socks. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, was a man of elite pedigree and military valor, an Ivy League graduate, a decorated World War II pilot, and former CIA director. But behind the cool, patrician exterior was a surprisingly goofy, sometimes awkward, and wonderfully strange individual whose quirks often surfaced in the most unexpected moments. Let's start with one of the most infamous presidential incidents of all time, the vomiting episode in Japan. In 1992, during a state dinner hosted by the Japanese Prime Minister, Bush, visibly unwell, leaned over and vomited into the lap of the Japanese leader before collapsing onto the floor. The entire event was caught on camera and broadcast globally. While clearly a moment of unfortunate illness, it became a cultural moment in Japan, even inspiring slang, bushusuru, meaning to do a bush. Bush laughed it off later, calling it my low point in international relations. But embarrassment never kept him down for long. In fact, Bush had a deep love of skydiving, especially on his birthdays. He first jumped in combat during World War II after his plane was shot down, but he took it up again in his retirement, jumping from planes at age 72, 75, 80, 85, and 90. He always went tandem, usually with members of the Army's Golden Knights, and insisted it was a beautiful way to celebrate life. When he jumped at 90, strapped to a soldier and waving to the crowd midair, he simply said, "Just because you're old doesn't mean you can't be a little wild." Bush also had a peculiar habit of writing thank you notes for everything by hand, in perfect cursive, not just to world leaders, but to janitors, interns, drivers, and even children who sent him drawings. He once wrote a thank you note to a TSA agent for being efficient and courteous, and another to a restaurant server for recommending the crab cakes with quiet confidence. He wrote thousands of notes during his life, believing gratitude was a lost art in politics. Staff joked that if you made Bush a sandwich, you'd get a thank you card within 48 hours. One of his strangest presidential moments came during a visit to a grocery store, where he reportedly expressed amazement at a barcode scanner. The press exploded with claims that Bush was out of touch, surprised by everyday technology. While the truth was more nuanced, he was reacting to a new generation of scanners that could weigh, price, and categorize instantly the moment stuck. He later quipped, "Next time I'll scan my socks just to prove I can." Then there was his unique way of speaking, full of quirky phrases and soft-spoken mutterings. He'd end thoughts with, "Not gonna do it," or "wouldn't be prudent," in that dry Texas, New England hybrid twang. He referred to people as kinder and gentler souls, called the Soviet Union, "those fellas over there," and used the word deep doo-doo in official briefings. His staff called it Bush speak, an endearing, if often baffling, dialect of optimism and understatement. These 5 strange facts reveal a president who is many things: dignified, yet goofy, brave, yet humble, elite, yet relatable. Bush wasn't a man of grand theatrics, was a man who jumped from planes at 90 and still wrote you a note about your kindness on the way down. His quirks were never distractions, they were expressions of gratitude, humility, and a quiet courage that never left him, even when his stomach did. And now, from a president who dove into birthdays and barfed into diplomacy, we move to Bill Clinton, man who played saxophone on late-night television, named his cat Socks but got jealous of its fan mail, and once spent an entire state dinner discussing UFOs because he just had to know. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, was a policy wonk with the charisma of a rock star, a Rhodes Scholar who could charm a room full of world leaders and then jam on the saxophone with late-night hosts. But behind the charm, offensive, and political acumen was a deeply quirky, often obsessive man with some strange passions, superstitions, and downright weird moments that helped define his presidency in the cultural imagination. Let's start with Socks the cat, perhaps the most famous feline in presidential history. Socks became a media darling during Clinton's first term, appearing in press photos, children's books, and official White House Christmas cards. Clinton adored the cat but also reportedly grew jealous of the amount of fan mail Socks received. According to staffers, he once joked, "I get letters about the deficit. Socks gets poems." When the Clintons later added a Labrador retriever named Buddy to the household, Socks was unceremoniously exiled from the White House to live with the Clinton secretary, leading to a long-running joke that Buddy had won the election at home. Clinton's saxophone obsession was no political stunt, it was real. He practiced regularly, brought his sax on the campaign trail, and famously played Heartbreak Hotel, on the Arsenio Hall show in 1992 while wearing sunglasses and a suit. The moment helped rebrand him as the cool candidate, but Clinton wasn't posturing. He once said that if he hadn't gone into politics, "I'd have ended up in a smoky jazz bar somewhere, playing round midnight until closing time, even as president. He'd retreat to the map room late at night to play solo sometimes for hours." Then there was his insatiable curiosity about aliens. Clinton was openly obsessed with UFOs and extraterrestrial life. He asked aides to dig through classified files, demanded briefings from the CIA and Air Force, and once told a reporter, "If the government has a file on aliens, I want to see it." He even joked that if aliens landed, "I wouldn't be surprised, but I might be relieved if they offered to help with Congress." Clinton later revealed he had read everything available on Roswell and Area 51 but found no smoking gun, though you could tell by his grin that he wished he had. Clinton also had a compulsive snacking habit, often fueled by stress. Despite being photographed jogging with a McDonald's bag in hand, he actually had an aide nicknamed the Food Sheriff, tasked with keeping his junk food in check. He loved Big Macs, jalapeno cheeseburgers, and anything covered in cheese. When the Food Sheriff wasn't looking, Clinton was known to sneak out of meetings to raid the kitchen for Doritos or sneak extra dessert at state dinners. Staff kept decoy salads around him during interviews, but insiders knew better. The man runs on carbs and charm. Lastly, Clinton had a near photographic memory for names and faces, which he used to spooky effect. He would greet staffers he hadn't seen in years by name and recall obscure facts about their families. Once, at a campaign stop, he spotted a woman in a crowd and asked, "How's your mom doing after that surgery in Little Rock?" She burst into tears. She was right. His memory, some said, was almost supernatural, and he used it like a magician uses sleight of hand to instantly connect, disarm, and impress. These 5 strange facts paint a portrait of a president driven by curiosity, craving connection, and powered by rhythm and recall. Clinton wasn't just strange, he was a whirlwind of contradictions. Brilliant and impulsive, disciplined in debate, but scattered in snacks, part policy genius, part late-night sax man. And now, from a president who battled Beltway chaos with jazz riffs and cat poems, we turn to George W. Bush, a man who once tried to make eye contact with a blind reporter, drew stick-figure war maps, and claimed he gave up golf out of respect for the troops, though aides say he just got bored. George W. Bush. George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, was a leader shaped by crisis and contradiction at times folksy and profound, at other times hilariously unpredictable. While history may remember him for the September event, Iraq, and his deeply polarizing policies, Bush's personal quirks created an entirely separate legend. A man who ruled the world's most powerful country, with the soul of a class clown and the habits of a misunderstood doodler. Let's begin with perhaps the most awkward and oddly charming moment of his presidency, attempting to make eye contact with a blind reporter. During a 2006 press conference, Bush called on Peter Walston of the Los Angeles Times, who was wearing dark sunglasses due to a degenerative eye condition. Bush, unaware, said with genuine concern, "Are you going to ask that question with those shades on?" To which Walston explained his blindness. The moment went viral. Bush immediately apologized, but the exchange embodied the kind of well-meaning awkwardness that trailed his public appearances. Later, he laughed it off with Walston privately, saying, "At least I didn't call you Four Eyes." Bush also had a fascination with stick-figure war maps. During military briefings, he would often draw crude diagrams of troop movements, enemy positions, or foreign borders complete with arrows, labels like "bad guys" and "frowny faces." Generals tried to guide him toward more precise intelligence visuals, but Bush found the simplified sketches more intuitive. Aides joked that he turned the Pentagon into a doodle pad. One of his personal folders even contained maps of the Middle East sketched in Sharpie, annotated with phrases like, "Not good," "Gotta watch this," and "Get him." Then there was the golf controversy. In 2008, Bush told reporters he had given up playing golf out of respect for the troops. The gesture was intended to show solidarity during the Iraq War. But later, some staff revealed the truth was more mundane, simply got bored with golf, and started mountain biking instead. Bush became an avid biker and often challenged Secret Service agents to races around his ranch in Crawford, Texas. He called it his thinking time, though staff noted he once fell off the bike while trying to wave and talk at the same time. Bush also had a bizarre habit of giving people nicknames, hundreds of them. He called Vladimir Putin Pooty Poot, Condoleezza Rice was Condi, Karl Rove was Turd Blossom, and reporters were often referred to by whatever popped into his head: Stretch, Pencil Neck, Peanut, Fuzz. Some found the nicknames juvenile, others saw them as disarming tools to build rapport. Bush claimed it was a way of breaking tension. "If I can't say your name, I'll make one up that fits better." And finally, there's his paintbrush renaissance. After leaving office, Bush took up painting, a hobby that began as therapy and evolved into a full-blown artistic second act. He painted portraits of world leaders, wounded veterans, his own pets, and even himself in the shower. The art world was bewildered. Critics were hesitant. But Bush leaned into it, publishing a book of his paintings and telling the Today Show, "People are surprised I can even read, let alone paint. The work is oddly tender, simple, sincere, and deeply unguarded." It was the ultimate twist, the axis of evil president now searching for peace in brushstrokes. These 5 strange facts sketch a different version of Bush, not the wartime decider or political polarizer, but the guy who renamed reporters, sketched maps like cartoons, and painted dogs in his retirement. He wasn't performative, he was just Bush-Hawkward, funny, deeply human, and maybe even weirder than we ever realized. And now, from a president who turned foreign policy into finger paintings, we enter the meticulously cool, oddly aloof orbit of Barack Obama, a man who wrote love letters in existential prose, killed flies mid-interview, and carried a perfectly creased tan suit that once caused a bigger scandal than most policy changes. Barack Obama. Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States, was often seen as the epitome of cool, articulate, composed, and camera-ready at all times. But beneath the razor-sharp suits, calculated speeches, and slow jazz swagger was a man with a peculiar mix of intellectual eccentricities, lightning reflexes, and a few controversies so oddly small they somehow became massive. Obama's personal strangeness didn't lie in chaos, it lay in how carefully, and sometimes absurdly, he choreographed even the smallest of details. Let's begin with the tan suit incident. In August 2014, Obama stepped into the White House briefing room wearing a beige-colored suit. To the casual observer, it was just a wardrobe change. But to certain political commentators and cable news networks, it was an outrage. Accusations flew. The suit was unpresidential, a metaphor for weakness, and somehow disrespectful during a time of global tension. Obama, amused by the fury, later joked about the uproar, calling it the most scandalous thing I did in 8 years. What's strange isn't the suit, it's the fact that it became one of the biggest controversies of his presidency. Obama was also famous for his ability to kill flies in camera. During a 2009 CNBC interview in the White House, a fly buzzed too close. Without breaking eye contact with the interviewer, Obama paused mid-answer, extended his hand, and snapped the fly out of the air with a single slap. "I got the sucker," he said. PETA sent a statement requesting he treat all life with respect given flies. The moment became viral, not just for the reflex, but for the surreal spectacle of a president delivering healthcare policy while executing insect assassinations. Long before his presidency, Obama wrote deeply existential love letters. As a young man, he corresponded with girlfriends using prose that blended philosophy, introspection, and abstraction. In one letter, he mused, "I think of you, of how the world is full of loneliness, masked by smiles and handshakes." Another included reflections on T.S. Eliot, Nietzsche, and the tension between individual freedom and connection. The letters, revealed decades later, read like the musings of a college poet trying to decode the universe-equal parts brilliance and brooding melodrama. Then there's his obsession with perfectly creased pants. Journalist David Brooks once said he knew Obama would be president because of the crease in his trousers. It was the mark of a man who knew how to take care of himself. Obama did, in fact, care deeply about appearance, insisting on tailored suits, immaculate shirt cuffs, and precise posture in photos. He once delayed a departure because his jacket had a wrinkle. But this wasn't just vanity, it was a psychological armor. In his own words, "You never get a second chance to make a first impression, especially when you're the first black man to get that chance." Finally, there was his superstitious basketball routine. Obama often played pickup games on Election Day every election day, believing it brought him luck. It began in 2008 and became a tradition. When aides suggested skipping it in 2012, Obama refused. "We play. That's how we win." His game wasn't just symbolish, was competitive, trash, talked respectfully, and even sprained his lip once while going in for a layup. After leaving office, he still used basketball courts to bond with foreign leaders, Secret Service agents, and young fans, often trash-talking them with a grin and a swish. These 5 strange facts show Obama not just as a calculated statesman, but as a man deeply attuned to symbolism, rhythm, and precision. He didn't chase scandal, he caught flies. He didn't show chaos, he folded it into creases. His presidency was jazz in a tailored suit, cool, unexpected, and full of moments that, while small, told a larger story about control, vulnerability, and the art of being watched. And now, from a president who turned fly swatting into political theater and pants into prophecy, we turn to Donald J. Trump, a man whose obsession with hand size became national debate, who refused to read memos longer than a page, and who once held a press briefing in front of a landscaping company by mistake, but insisted it was perfect anyway. Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump, the 45th hand now, once again 47th President of the United States, may be the most surreal political figure in modern history. A real estate mogul, reality television star, and populist firebrand, Trump brought to the presidency a blend of showmanship, pettiness, branding, and strangeness so overwhelming that even his mundane moments became national events. His eccentricities weren't just personnel, they were his governing style, his PR strategy, and sometimes his political philosophy. Let's begin with the hand-size obsession, a decades-long feud that started with a comment in Spy magazine, which jokingly referred to Trump as a short-fingered vulgarian. Trump never forgot. In interviews, debates, and even court depositions, he brought up the size of his hands, insisting they were large, and, by implication, so was everything else. During the 2016 Republican primary, he famously responded to Marco Rubio's jab about his hands by saying, "Look at those hands. Are they small hands?" And he referred to my hands if they're small. Something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. It was the first time a presidential debate went fully Freudian. Then there's the briefing aversion. Trump is known to have refused traditional intelligence briefings if they were longer than a single page or not supplemented with photos, graphs, or bolded text. Officials had to condense complex foreign policy updates into visual-heavy flashcards. His attention span was so limited that aides reportedly adopted the CNN trick, crafting documents that mimicked cable news chyrons to keep him engaged. If it didn't read like a headline, it was ignored. One of the most iconic moments of Trump's strangeness occurred in 2020, when his legal team led by Rudy Giuliani held a press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a small company wedged between a crematorium and an adult bookstore in Philadelphia. Originally believed to be a scheduling mistake, they likely meant to book the Four Seasons Hotel, the campaign insisted it was intentional. Giuliani gave his statement beneath a garage door, flanked by garden equipment. Trump later tweeted in full caps, "Four Seasons Total Landscaping, a great American company." The moment became instant folklore, symbolizing, in a single frame, the chaos, improvisation, and sheer absurdity of his political universe. Trump's obsession with fast food is legendary. He prefers it not for the taste, though he is said to love a McDonald's Filet-O-Fish, but because he trusts the consistency and cleanliness. "At least you know what you're getting," he said. During the 2019 government shutdown, he served the Clemson Tigers college football team a buffet of McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger King, and pizza in the White House. With silver platters and candles, the spread looked like a medieval feast prepared by Ronald McDonald. "Great American food," he said proudly, standing beside Big Macs and heat lamps. And then there's his infatuation with his own name. Trump's name has been stamped on everything: buildings, planes, steaks, ties, water bottles, a university, and even a board game. Inside the White House, he reportedly requested that documents be printed with his name in large, bold letters at the top, just so there was no mistake who had authorized them. Foreign leaders were briefed on how to compliment Trump by mentioning his brand. One aide said, "It wasn't just egoed, was a strategy for influence. To Trump, the presidency was not a role, was a logo." These 5 strange facts reveal a man for whom politics became performance art, whose eccentricities weren't hidden, but deployed like campaign slogans. Trump didn't have quirks. He weaponized them. His hand size, his fast food feasts, and even landscaping fiascos became rallying cries. Love him or loathe him, he shattered every presidential mold and then autographed the shards. And now, from a president who branded the world in his own name and held pressers between sex shops and sod, we move to Joe Biden, a president who loves ice cream so much it's practically a food group, tells rambling ghost stories during speeches, and once sprinted across the White House lawn to prove he still had the legs for the job. Joe Biden. Joe Biden, the 46th President of the United States, brought to the office a lifetime of political experience, personal tragedy, and an endlessly folksy demeanor that veers, at times, into the surreal. While his policies have ignited both fierce loyalty and fierce opposition, it's his peculiar blend of grandfatherly warmth, verbal meandering, and ice-cream-fueled optimism that sets him apart as one of the strange-stand most human figures to occupy the modern White House. Let's begin with Biden's ice cream obsession. It's not a running gadget, it's a defining trait. Biden has referred to himself as a chocolate chip guy, and rarely appears in public without being photographed mid-cone. He's known to keep a freezer stocked with ice cream at the White House, and once bought every staffer at a campaign stop a scoop of their choice just so he wouldn't eat alone. During a virtual fundraiser, he once veered off topic for 2 full minutes to discuss the ideal temperature and cone structure. "You get the right kind of cone," he said seriously, "and that changes the whole game." Then there are his rambling ghost stories often told during speeches, with a kind of spectral confidence. At a 2022 event in Pennsylvania, Biden launched into a tale about Corn Pop, a razor-wielding tough guy from his lifeguard days in the 1960s, whom Biden claimed to have stared down with a length of chain. He's recounted that story multiple times, along with others involving mysterious uncles, phantom trains, and dramatic standoffs from decades past. Critics call them incoherent, fans call them folklore. Either way, they've become part of the Biden mythos. Another oddity: Biden has a strange habit of whispering into the microphone. Mid-speech, leaning forward, eyes wide, lowering his voice like he's revealing a secret. "Pay them more," he once whispered during a discussion on wages, jolting audiences with the sudden ASMR-like intimacy. It happens frequently, sometimes as emphasis, sometimes seemingly for dramatic flair. Whatever the purpose, the Biden whisper has become a signature maneuver, as if he's pulling the entire nation into a huddle. He's also intensely superstitious about his sunglasses. Biden's beloved aviators are not just fashion, they're ritual. He owns over a dozen identical pairs, and often refuses to remove them during emotional or high-stakes moments. During the Obama administration, Biden was once seen pacing a secure room wearing sunglasses indoors, insisting they helped him focus without the nonsense. They've become part of his branda, cross between fighter pilot and grandfather, and staff are said to carry backup pairs in case of emergency. And finally, there's his penchant for impromptu jogging. Biden frequently breaks into sprints mid-event, mid-stage exit, even on the White House lawn, often to show he's still got the legs for the job. While meant to exude vitality, the sudden jogs have startled photographers, knocked over staff, and once resulted in him nearly colliding with a cameraman during a NATO summit. At a graduation ceremony, he ran up the steps, threw both hands in the air, and shouted, "Not bad for 80, huh?" These 5 strange facts reveal a president who leads with emotion, symbolism, and an almost mystical sense of self-image. Biden's quirks aren't random, they're ritual. He whispers like a prophet, jogs like a linebacker, and treats ice cream like national policy. Whether you see him as eccentric or endearing, his presidency has become a living montage of Americana filtered through aviator lenses and Scoops Ahoy optimism. And with that, our journey through the most strange facts about U.S. presidents comes to a closer. Perhaps not. After all, in American history, the truth is often stranger than the fiction. And the fiction sounds a lot like next week's press conference.